Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we dive nose first into the surprisingly pungent past of royal women and their, shall we say, questionable hygiene habits. Imagine an opulent palace chamber glowing with candlelight, velvet drapes cascading from gilded ceilings, and perfume heavy in the air. But not because someone just stepped out of a fresh bath. Oh no! That lingering scent. It's masking something much earthier. This isn't the story of Disney princesses in spotless gowns or modern duchesses with skincare routines sponsored by luxury brands. No, this is a tale of history's most elite women, queens, empresses and noble ladies who rarely, if ever, bathed. And when they did, it was more of a scented soak than a scrub. They didn't just skip showers, they elevated the cover up to an art form. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I want to know which time zone my fellow night owls are snoozing in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Perfume over bath water. That's where we begin. Royal women throughout history have always been under pressure to look and smell pleasing. Cleanliness, however, wasn't always part of that equation. In medieval Europe, for instance, water was often feared rather than welcomed. Doctors of the time believed that soaking opened up the pores and made one vulnerable to bad humours or disease. So rather than wash the body, women perfumed it, and perfume they did. The French court under Louis XIV practically invented olfactory warfare. His mistresses and courtiers would douse themselves in floral waters and musk, their silken gowns soaked in rose oils, orange blossom, or sometimes civet, a musky secretion from the rear glands of a small mammal. Yes, you heard that right. Civet was so popular that it lingered as a perfume base for centuries, despite its, shall we say, animal undertones. One of Louis XIV's favourites, Madame de Montespan, was famed not just for her beauty, but for the clouds of scent that preceded her entrance. She reportedly preferred her own blend of ambergris, musk, rose and bergamot. Lovely to the nose, but intense enough to mask several days, sometimes weeks, of body odour. But this trend didn't begin or end in France. Elizabeth I of England was famous for her strict routines, which included scented gloves, perfumed skirts, and body powders made of crushed herbs and dried flowers. She used lavender, thyme, and even sage, powdered and stuffed into her clothing to fend off not just bad smells, but also the ever-lurking plague. Now let's talk about the bath, or lack thereof. Bathing, in many periods, was considered risky. In the 17th century, for example, European doctors warned against submerging the body entirely in water, claiming it stripped the skin of its natural defences. Royal physicians suggested that cleaning the hands, face, and possibly the feet with a damp cloth was more than enough. For the rest of the body, that's what linen shifts and perfume were for. One famous example is Marie Antoinette. Despite being one of the most fashionable women of her time, she didn't bathe regularly in the way we might imagine. She had a perfumed water bath drawn only on special occasions. Most of the time she kept clean through a regimen of sponging herself with scented cloths and changing her underclothes multiple times a day, again without washing them first. Just fresh from the armoire, scented with sachets of herbs. Even earlier in the medieval period, bathing was considered not only dangerous, but downright sinful by some. There were public bathhouses, yes, but these often doubled as places of ill repute. Noble women avoided them, preferring privacy and minimal washing. Queen Isabella of Castile famously bragged that she had only bathed twice in her entire life, once at birth and once on her wedding night. Charming. And yet, paradoxically, many of these royal women had elaborate bathing chambers installed in their castles and palaces. These rooms were not used frequently, but they were grand. Marble tubs, gold taps and perfumed oils everywhere. The baths were more for status than sanitation, a place to soak in luxury, perhaps once a month, but rarely more. A clean body wasn't the goal. A luxurious one was. This focus on perfume over purity wasn't limited to Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, royal women in the harem practiced meticulous scent layering. They would begin with rose water for the skin, follow with incense smoked into their hair, and finish with oils of jasmine or sandalwood. Actual bathing was reserved for ceremonial days and special occasions. A particularly opulent example was Empress Josephine, Napoleon's first wife. She was known to be obsessively fond of musk and reportedly had her rooms perfumed daily. Napoleon, returning from his campaigns, famously sent word ahead, "Don't wash." He preferred her natural scent over cleanliness, a preference that today might raise a few eyebrows and nostrils. The strangest part, all this perfume didn't necessarily mean people smelled good. The layers of oils, musk and sweat mixed into a bouquet that was potent, but not necessarily pleasant. It was in many cases a signature scent, one that lingered in hallways, stained bed linens and clung to velvet cloaks. It wasn't about fooling anyone into thinking you were clean. It was about embracing a completely different idea of beauty. One quirky fact: in the Elizabethan court there were specialised perfumers who catered exclusively to the nobility. They didn't just craft fragrances, they designed entire olfactory identities. A duchess might have a different scent for court appearances, garden strolls and romantic evenings. And her perfume was often more closely guarded than her jewellery, lest a rival duplicate her scent and steal her thunder. But even with all this fragrance, the smell of the royal court was complicated. Imagine a room full of people who haven't bathed, wearing animal-based perfumes, surrounded by beeswax candles and densely packed upholstery that trapped every odour. That's not just a fire hazard, that's a nose hazard, and yet people adapted. Court etiquette included not just how you bowed, but how you sniffed. A subtle wrinkling of the nose could be a deadly insult. A strong whiff followed by a fan flutter meant someone nearby had skimped on the lavender sachets. There were even stories of duels started over scent-based slights, because nothing says noble pride like stabbing someone over body odour. Historians still argue whether this aversion to bathing was truly based on medical advice or simply a matter of inconvenience. Water was hard to heat, servants were needed to lug it around, and private baths took hours to prepare. Add to that the cultural belief that a strong perfume equaled refinement, and you have a recipe for centuries of aromatic cover-ups. All of this raises the question, did these royal women know they were funky? Possibly. But in a world where everyone around you smelled equally ripe, it wasn't an issue, and with social rank came olfactory immunity. You couldn't exactly tell the Queen she stinks. You bowed, smiled, and tried to breathe through your mouth. So next time you light a candle and pour a bubble bath, remember, your evening ritual would have shocked some of the most powerful women in history. Clean skin was once considered a risk to both body and soul, while a well-perfumed armpit was the height of sophistication. And for those still clinging to ancient wisdom, there's always the option to dab on a little musk, skip the shower, and declare yourself royally fragrant. Behind the glimmering facades of royal palaces and the flowing silks of court gowns, another truth lingers, one far less glamorous and faintly odorous. When it came time to address nature's more urgent calls, royal women found themselves navigating a world of chamber pots, privacy screens, and sheer determination. This wasn't a matter of porcelain toilets and discreet plumbing. No, this was the chamber pot ballet, and it was equal parts choreography and chaos. In an era before flushing toilets, every royal woman, regardless of rank, had to use what was called a close stool, a decorative box with a hidden pot beneath a cushioned seat. It was often disguised to blend in with the furniture, so well crafted that it might pass for a footstool or reading bench. Some were even gilded or inlaid with ivory. Form, yes, but function, still dubious. Of course, these stools didn't empty themselves. That task fell to a select few servants known as the groom of the stool, or, in female households, chambermaids of considerable discretion. These individuals were among the most trusted in the royal circle, given how intimate their duties were. Their job was not just to clean, but to monitor the Queen's health, maintain a ready pot at all times, and ensure everything was handled with swift, silent efficiency. Privacy was a luxury even queens seldom fully enjoyed. Let's picture Versailles at its peak, the Sun King's court shimmering with mirrors, music, and mystery. Now imagine one of his mistresses, perhaps Madame de Pompadour, trying to discreetly excuse herself from a salon filled with powdered wigs and sharp tongues. The chamber pot wouldn't be far. In fact, it was likely concealed behind an embroidered screen just steps away. She'd shuffle behind it, servants helping with the many layers of skirts and petticoats, and, well, nature would take its course while music played on the other side. It wasn't uncommon for courtiers to relieve themselves behind curtains or tapestries during long receptions. There are accounts of nobles using stairwells, corners, and even fireplaces, anything that allowed them to stay within earshot of court gossip while avoiding the trek to an actual privy. This was not laziness. It was strategy. Being away from the court for too long could mean missing a key political moment, or worse, giving a rival the chance to whisper something damaging in the king's ear. One particularly vivid anecdote comes from the court of Catherine de' Medici. It's said that she had several hidden commodes built into her personal apartments, artfully masked by cabinetry and drapery. Servants were trained to clear the pots so discreetly that guests often never realised they had dined just feet from a functioning toilet. Now that's ambience. But not all royal women had the benefit of such clever architecture. In Tudor England, palaces like Hampton Court were so vast and so underplumbed that chamber pots were the norm, even in royal bedrooms. Elizabeth I herself likely used a close stool with lace-trimmed cloth and rose petals to mask the smell. The petals helped, but only so much. And when chamber pots weren't available, the solution was the bordaloo, a small oblong porcelain vessel designed for women to squat over, even while standing. Named after a Jesuit preacher whose sermons were famously long-winded, these portable pots allowed noble women to maintain dignity during extended events, without the need to excuse themselves. They would discreetly slip one under their skirts, do their business, and pass it to a maid, often without anyone noticing. Talk about multitasking. Despite the ingenuity, things weren't always smooth or odourless. Chamber pots needed regular emptying, and servants tasked with this chore didn't always work quickly or cleanly. In large palaces with hundreds of residents, the collective use of pots created what some 18th century writers politely called an air of consequence, and what modern readers might call a revolting stench. To combat this, royals leaned heavily on potpourri, incense, and scented handkerchiefs. Some even carried pomanders, metal orbs filled with aromatic herbs, to hold to their noses in particularly foul moments. These weren't just accessories, they were essential tools of olfactory survival. And it wasn't just about bodily waste. Royal women also had to contend with the social waste of judgment. One misstep, one audible moment, one unfortunate spill, and it could be the stuff of court legend. Maintaining grace and decorum during nature's most human moments became a form of performance art. In fact, etiquette books of the 17th and 18th centuries included specific instructions for women on how to retire with elegance. For example, one should never refer directly to the need to use the chamber pot. Instead, euphemisms like refreshing one's toilette or taking a moment to compose oneself were preferred. The irony, of course, is that everyone knew what was going on, but the illusion of refinement had to be maintained at all costs. And if you're imagining that these pots were emptied into some sophisticated underground system, think again. Most often, servants dumped them out of palace windows into the courtyards below or into nearby rivers. In France, it was common to shout "Garde l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, before tossing a full pot into the street. Pedestrians learned quickly to hug the buildings and carry umbrellas even on sunny days. The smell, the stains, the ever-present risk of public embarrassment, all were part of the delicate dance of royal defecation. And still, these women did it in corsets, with multiple layers of petticoats, and sometimes with an audience of attendants. Talk about pressure. One peculiar practice that surfaced in the 18th century was the use of perfumed paper to line chamber pots. The idea was that the paper would not only absorb waste but emit a pleasant scent. In reality, it did very little to help, but it made people feel better. Much like scented candles during a blackout. Comforting, even if largely ineffective. Historians still debate how much control royal women really had over their own privacy. While queens like Victoria insisted on more modern facilities later in life, earlier figures had to adapt to their surroundings, regardless of comfort, and while men of the court might slip off to relieve themselves in corridors or gardens, women were held to stricter standards of decorum. Yet some broke the rules with flair. There are whispered stories of duchesses who timed their retreats to coincide with political conversations, using the moment to eavesdrop. Others reportedly faked illness to gain solitude, and perhaps, finally, an undisturbed moment with a chamber pot that didn't involve a crowd of hovering ladies-in-waiting. One fringe tale even tells of a Russian noblewoman who had her chamber pot custom-painted with scenes from Greek mythology, so that even her most personal moments were framed in the glory of the gods. Whether she found inspiration or irony in those images remains lost to history. Even the design of furniture accommodated the inevitability of human waste. Certain chairs doubled as toilets, with removable seats and hidden compartments. In some royal households, it wasn't uncommon for guests to find themselves seated on a throne that was quite literal in its function. Just imagine trying to enjoy a delicate dessert while your host's furniture gives off the faint aroma of last week's stew. Over time, plumbing improved, and the chamber pot slowly vanished from palatial life, but the traces remained, quite literally. Hidden compartments in antique furniture, lingering scents in centuries-old tapestries, and historical records that speak frankly about what went on behind the screens. And through it all, royal women carried themselves with remarkable poise. They adapted to an environment where hygiene was relative, privacy was a privilege, and waste was an ever-present companion. They mastered the art of appearing serene while managing the very human realities of the body, framed always in lace, silk, and strategically placed potpourri. In a world where power and appearances were everything, even relieving oneself became an act of diplomacy. In the flickering candlelight of 16th and 17th century court chambers, one thing glittered more than the gold embroidery or gem-studded gowns: a noblewoman's face. Pale as porcelain, her complexion often shimmered with an eerie, powdery glow. It looked ethereal from a distance, especially by candlelight, but the truth behind that luminous look was far more sinister. Welcome to the era of lead face masks, where beauty came at the price of health and sometimes sanity. This obsession with fair, blemish-free skin wasn't merely about fashion. It was tangled in centuries of social and political symbolism. Pale skin meant leisure, nobility, and the luxury of living indoors, far from labouring in the sun. A woman with a glowing ivory face didn't just appear youthful, she appeared powerful. And for royal women, whose every wrinkle was a threat to their social standing, this wasn't optional. Enter Venetian ceruse, the era's most coveted cosmetic made from white lead and vinegar. It produced a rich, opaque white paste that could be smoothed across the face and neck to mask imperfections. The result was ghostly, glowing, and devastatingly toxic. Royal women layered it on thick, and then thicker still. Elizabeth I, who reigned through England's golden age, is perhaps the most infamous user of this deadly beautifier. After suffering a bout of smallpox in her late 20s, she was left with facial scars that she covered using ceruse. Over time, the constant application and removal of the lead mixture caused her skin to break down, leading to more blemishes, requiring yet more ceruse. It was a vicious, powdery cycle, but ceruse was only the beginning. Many royal women also applied a concoction of egg whites to give their skin a tight, glossy finish. It acted like an early version of primer. The effect was dramatic, especially under candlelight, but one wrong facial movement could cause the egg film to crack, something no amount of royal poise could hide. And then came the masks. Nighttime beauty rituals in the court were not about cucumber slices and gentle moisturizers. Instead, some women applied thick face masks of vinegar-soaked bread, lead paste, or even crushed pearl powder. These masks promised to lighten the skin, tighten the pores, and hide any signs of fatigue. They were also highly corrosive. Some women in France and Italy went a step further, applying a layer of mercury mixed with alum beneath their white paint. Mercury, yes, the silvery stuff now known to cause neurological damage, was believed to rejuvenate the skin. It also caused tremors, hair loss, mood swings, and, in extreme cases, death. Historians still argue whether the death of certain royal women, including members of Catherine de Medici's circle, were accelerated by mercury-based cosmetics. The face wasn't the only target of dangerous beauty. Lips were stained red with mixtures containing cinnabar, another mercury compound, or crushed cochineal bugs. While technically organic, these bugs were sometimes preserved with alcohols and vinegars that irritated the skin and gums. Royal smiles might gleam ruby red, but behind them, teeth often rotted silently, masked by black wax or discreetly clenched lips. Eyes, too, came under the brush. To enlarge the pupils and give a dreamy, doe-like expression, women used belladonna, an extract from the deadly nightshade plant. Just a drop or two would do. The result was stunning in candlelight, but often came with dizziness, blurry vision, and a risk of long-term blindness. Still, the look was considered worth it. The fringe side of this cosmetic culture is as surreal as it is disturbing. In some royal courts, particularly during the Renaissance, women would use powdered mummy dust, yes, actual ground-up remains of Egyptian mummies, as a skincare ingredient. It was believed to carry the ancient power of the pharaohs and to imbue youthfulness. The practice, while rare, was real enough to spawn an underground market in mummy remains, which were imported, ground into powder, and sold in apothecaries across Europe. More mainstream, though still bizarre, were snail facials. Court ladies in Spain and parts of Italy used live snails, allowing them to crawl across the face in hopes that their slime would smooth wrinkles and hydrate the skin. The mucin was said to be rich in healing properties, but the experience was hardly serene. Picture a duchess lying stock still while slimy garden guests meander across her brow. Of course, none of this glamour came easy. These routines were time-consuming, expensive, and physically taxing. Application of lead-based makeup required an expert hand, often a lady-in-waiting trained specifically in the fine art of face dressing. The mixture had to be blended just right. Too thick and it would flake off during conversation. Too thin and it revealed the blemishes it was meant to hide. The removal process was equally brutal, involving vinegar-soaked cloths and scraping tools. Skin, already compromised by toxins, grew thinner and more fragile with each treatment. It wasn't just the skin that suffered. Prolonged exposure to lead and mercury often caused psychological symptoms. There are letters and diaries from the era describing noblewomen who became increasingly paranoid, forgetful or erratic over time, symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Yet these changes were often blamed on hysteria, or the natural burdens of femininity. Few saw the connection between the glowing faces and the darkening minds behind them, and still they painted on. Why? Because the stakes were so high. A flawless face wasn't vanity, it was survival. For many royal women, especially those in foreign courts or politically fragile positions, beauty equaled power. A single blemish could be interpreted as weakness. An aging face could signal the end of influence, the cooling of a king's affections or the rise of a rival. And rivals were everywhere. In Louis XIV's court alone, dozens of women vied for his favour at any given time. The wrong shade of blush or the appearance of a wrinkle could be fatal to one's courtly career, so the women powdered, painted and poisoned themselves in pursuit of radiance. One open debate among historians is whether any of these royal women knew the long-term effects of their beauty routines. Some argue they couldn't have known, that the science simply wasn't there. Others suggest they suspected the damage, but felt trapped by societal expectations and royal duties. After all, when your marriage, alliances, and safety depend on appearing ageless, you do what's necessary. Even the young were not spared. Noble girls as young as 12 were sometimes introduced to mild versions of these regimens, tiny dabs of lead powder, gentle egg-white masks, so that by the time they came of age, they were already well versed in the language of cosmetic warfare. Of course, not everyone played along. A few rebel voices emerged over the centuries, queens and princesses who favoured natural beauty, eschewed heavy powders, and chose simplicity. Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, was said to prefer a clean face and minimal scent, scandalising some of the more powdered ladies of court. But these women were exceptions, often tolerated because of strong political backing or the affection of their monarchs. For most, the mask remained firmly in place. Even in death, the illusion endured. Noblemen were often embalmed with layers of makeup to preserve the image of perfection. In some cases, their burial clothes included small jars of lead powder and rouge, should they need to look their best in the afterlife. And here's the irony. The same beauty standards that demanded flawlessness ultimately hastened decay. Teeth fell out, hair thinned, skin bruised and blistered beneath the surface, all while the outward mask smiled serenely from the throne. Today, of course, the beauty industry has moved beyond lead and mercury, thankfully, but echoes of those ancient routines remain. We still chase flawless skin, still layer on foundations and concealers, still believe that beauty is armour. Only now our weapons come in sleek packaging with celebrity endorsements. Still, it's worth remembering that some of history's most admired women spent their lives hiding behind poisonous masks. And beneath the powder and polish, they endured not just the weight of crowns, but the burden of being beautiful at all costs. In the gilded courts of Europe, where powdered cheeks and delicate perfumes reigned supreme, another more crawling issue festered beneath the surface, quite literally. Royal heads, crowned with intricate coiffures and architectural wigs, often became the perfect habitat for lice, mites, and worse. This wasn't just a case of the occasional itch. This was a full-blown infestation masked by fashion, with towering wigs concealing entire microcosms of movement, pomade, and in some cases, even wildlife. Let's begin at the height of wig mania, 18th century France. Think Versailles in all its pastel-drenched glory. At court, it wasn't enough for a noblewoman to have long flowing hair. She needed volume, height, and a sense of drama. Hair was padded, teased, powdered, and stacked into gravity-defying styles that could reach over 2 feet tall. The wigs themselves were feats of engineering, constructed from human hair, horsehair, and even wool. They were stiffened with wireframes and covered in pomade, a thick paste made from animal fat and sometimes scented oils to help them hold their shape. But with great volume came great vulnerability. That luscious layer of grease, ideal for attracting dust, mould, and a variety of pests. Lice thrived in these towering headpieces, burrowing deep into the seams and seams of padding. And because removing the wigs was time-consuming, and restyling them even more so, many royal women wore the same elaborate wigs for days, sometimes weeks, at a time. Marie Antoinette, ever the fashion icon, took things to new heights, literally. She helped popularise the pouf style, massive wigs shaped like ships, gardens, or even bird cages, complete with tiny mechanical elements. One infamous wig featured a model of a French naval vessel commemorating a military victory. Impressive, yes. Practical? Absolutely not. Women wearing these towering constructions often had to kneel to enter a carriage or sleep with their heads propped up to avoid crushing their coiffure. To keep their masterpieces intact, wigs were powdered nightly, often with starch made from wheat or rice flour, laced with perfumes like lavender or orris root. The powder helped absorb oil and keep the wig fresh, but it also created a cakey residue that clung to skin and clothing. Combined with the animal fat pomade underneath, this created a dense, sticky environment ripe for lice and utterly resistant to ventilation. But here's the wildest part. They didn't just accept the infestation, they prepared for it. In some royal courts, special scratching tools called head scratchers, or scratching sticks, were made from ivory, tortoiseshell, or gold. These elegant little implements allowed a noblewoman to reach under her wig and soothe the inevitable itch in public without appearing vulgar. Scratching, it seemed, could be made fashionable. The problem became so widespread that ladies-in-waiting often had to inspect their mistresses' wigs for signs of movement. If the infestation was too severe, the entire wig was discarded, not cleaned. Cleaning was risky. Animal fat melts in heat, and moisture could ruin the shape. So into the fire it went, and a new, equally vulnerable wig took its place. In some cases, women kept multiple wigs, one for formal appearances, one for casual days, and one for lounging. Of course, casual was still relative. Even a simple court wig required multiple hours of preparation, and each one, once worn, started its countdown to eventual lice takeover. A few physicians of the time tried to warn about the health risks. There were murmurs that the constant weight and tightness of the wigs could cause headaches, hair loss, even neck strain. And some doctors noted that the pomade and powders clogged pores, leading to breakouts and scalp infections. But in a world where beauty equaled influence, these concerns were largely ignored. Fashion marched on, itching but undeterred. Historians still argue whether lice truly ran rampant among the highest tiers of royalty, or whether the worst infestations were among lower nobles imitating court trends. Some claim that queens and empresses could afford to have their wigs cleaned, replaced, or treated regularly, especially if they had entire salons of maids dedicated to hair care. But anecdotal accounts from visitors to the courts suggest that even the wealthiest heads weren't spared. If anything, their wigs were bigger, greasier, and therefore more appealing to tiny six-legged invaders. In a particularly odd twist of fashion, some court ladies began integrating scratching into flirtation. A subtle tap of the head scratcher near the temple could be interpreted as coy interest. A dramatic full-sweep scratch? Possibly an invitation. Etiquette books of the time quietly acknowledged the dual use of these implements, often disguising their purpose as ornamental gestures. There were even fringe rumours, though never fully confirmed, that some noblewomen hid small sachets of insect-repelling herbs within their wigs. Lavender, rosemary and mint were favourites, thought to ward off not just pests but ill humours and bad smells. These sachets might be sewn into the padding or pinned beneath curls. Still, against the stubborn resilience of lice, herbs offered only mild resistance. And then came the birds. It sounds like folklore, but multiple sources from the period describe wigs so elaborate, so unmoving, that birds occasionally mistook them for real perches, or worse, nests. One infamous tale involves a duchess whose wig, modelled after an English rose garden, actually attracted a sparrow that laid eggs in the branches of her faux hedge. By the time her maid discovered the tiny nest, 2 chicks had already hatched. Whether true or not, the story speaks volumes about just how wild wig culture had become, yet the appeal was undeniable. A towering powdered wig signified wealth, status, and impeccable taste. And as hairstyles became more exaggerated, the sheer impracticality became a badge of honour. After all, if you could afford to wear a 4-foot wig adorned with glass fruit, you clearly weren't lifting furniture or chasing chickens around the courtyard. There's even a quirky historical tidbit. During particularly cold winters, some women used their wigs as makeshift heaters. The thick padding, combined with layers of powder and pomade, insulated the scalp like a furry hat. Uncomfortable, likely, but warm. And in icy stone castles, warmth was not something to scoff at. One surprising shift came with the French Revolution. As wigs became associated with the decadence of the aristocracy, fashion pivoted dramatically. Simple styles, shorter hair and natural curls came into vogue. Women who once braided wigs with swan feathers and doll-sized furniture now wore cotton caps or styled their real hair, often cut short in symbolic solidarity with the working class. It was a drastic change, and not everyone adapted gracefully. Marie Antoinette herself tried to modernise her image, adopting looser hairstyles and simpler gowns in the years leading up to the Revolution. But the damage was done. Her towering poufs had become symbols of elite excess, and no amount of shepherdess chic could undo that. In later centuries, with the advent of improved hygiene practices and better understanding of disease, wigs fell out of daily fashion and returned to ceremonial use. Royal women opted for more manageable hairstyles, and lice retreated to more modest hiding places. Still, the legacy of the royal wig lingers, literally and figuratively. Antique wigs preserved in museums still carry traces of powder, pomade, and sometimes even knits sealed within the fibres. A few have been X-rayed to reveal the wire structures underneath, tiny cathedrals of vanity and ambition. These were not just accessories, they were declarations of identity, ambition, and control. Today, when you see those towering hairstyles in period dramas or costume balls, it's easy to romanticise the elegance. But beneath the curls, beyond the feathers, lies a deeper truth. These wigs were heavy, itchy, and sometimes alive. They were expressions of beauty in a time when cleanliness was complicated, and where a woman's head could be both her crowning glory and her itchiest burden. Silk, velvet, brocade. From the outside, the gowns worn by royal women shimmer with opulence and grace. But beneath all that fabric, something much less graceful is brewing. Sweat, heat, and a whole lot of trapped air. Royal fashion was never about comfort. It was about presence, grandeur, intimidation even. And to achieve that, women were often wrapped, laced and sewn into layer upon layer of clothing so heavy and restrictive they could barely breathe, let alone cool off. To truly appreciate the ordeal, let's unravel the layers. Start with a chemise, usually linen, worn next to the skin. On top of that, a corset or stays pulled tight by a lady-in-waiting determined to cinch the waist down to wasp-like proportions. This wasn't just for shape, it was also a kind of scaffolding. Everything else, skirts, bodices, overskirts and court gowns, was built on top of this rigid core. Next came the petticoats, often multiple, each with its own layer of fabric and embellishment. Then, the hoops, or farthingales, wooden, metal or whalebone structures designed to flare the skirts outward. By the 18th century, some of these contraptions were so wide that women had to walk sideways through doors. Above all this sat the gown itself, embroidered, beaded and frequently lined with fur. And don't forget sleeves, collars, gloves, undersleeves, detachable cuffs, and, if the occasion called for it, a long trailing train. Once fully dressed, a royal woman might carry 30 to 40 pounds of clothing on her body. That's about the weight of a toddler, except less cooperative and a lot sweatier. This kind of dressing wasn't a solo act. Royal women needed a small team of attendants to layer them into their wardrobes each morning. Dressing could take up to 2 hours, depending on the formality of the event. Court dress codes were infamously specific. Appear at the wrong time in the wrong gown, and a duchess could find herself out of favour, or worse, out of invitation. But all this splendour came at a very real bodily cost. These clothes trapped heat like an oven. Castles and palaces were often poorly ventilated, especially during crowded court events. Fireplaces belched smoke, candlelight flickered against tapestries, and the press of other heavily dressed bodies created a microclimate that was part Turkish bath, part perfume counter, part livestock barn. Underneath it all, royal women sweated, profusely. But removing layers was rarely an option. Modesty, protocol, and the sheer logistics of undressing made it nearly impossible to cool off discreetly. So women endured it, dabbing their faces with handkerchiefs and tucking dried herbs into their bodices in an attempt to mask the inevitable body odour. Those herbs, by the way, were part of a broader olfactory strategy. Lavender, rosemary and lemon balm were the popular choices, sewn into sachets or tucked into pockets. Not just to scent the body, but to try and keep the stench of others at bay. The corset deserves its own sweaty spotlight. Though romanticised in modern fashion, corsets in royal courts were instruments of bodily discipline. Tightly laced from girlhood, they shaped the ribcage, reduced lung capacity, and often caused fainting spells. Royal women fainted so often that court physicians simply chalked it up to delicacy or nervous disposition. In truth, they often couldn't get enough air. Historians still argue how much real damage corsets caused. Some say that with proper fitting and breaks, they weren't as torturous as legends claim. Others point to X-rays of compressed ribs and displaced organs in remains of noble women. Regardless of where you land in the debate, one thing's certain: combining a tight corset with 90-degree heat and 3 layers of unwashed silk was a recipe for collapse, and collapse they did. There are records of queens and duchesses swooning mid-ceremony, only to be discreetly caught and carried off by waiting attendants. In some palaces, fainting couches were strategically placed in hallways and dressing rooms, just in case. Imagine planning your outfit knowing you'd need a lie down halfway through the day. Not for comfort, but for survival. But the effects weren't just temporary. Constant heat and moisture created a breeding ground for skin rashes, fungal infections and heat boils. Without regular washing, and remember, bathing was sporadic at best, skin under the corset became raw and inflamed. Some women suffered chronic back pain and skin ulcers, and yet they tightened the laces again the next morning. Because appearance always came before health. Perhaps one of the most telling symptoms of this hidden discomfort was the rise of stomacher fashion. A stomacher was a stiff, often bejewelled panel that covered the front of a woman's torso. It looked regal and polished, but it also served to hide the redness and blotchiness caused by the corset beneath. Think of it as an 18th century cover-up for heat rash. Now, let's talk footwear. Royal women weren't exactly striding through gardens in sneakers. Shoes were typically made from soft leather or silk with fragile soles and little to no arch support. Walking in them was delicate work. Combine that with heavy skirts and rigid posture, and it's a wonder anyone moved at all. If you've ever tripped in a long prom dress, imagine doing it in 40 pounds of brocade while balancing a wig, holding a fan, and maintaining an unbothered expression. Fringe accounts tell of royal women who developed peculiar walking styles, not out of grace, but necessity. The mincing walk with short, dainty steps wasn't always about femininity. It was about avoiding a fall under the weight of one's wardrobe. Some even took to gliding along walls for balance, or subtly leaning on a maid's arm when decorum allowed. Add menstruation to the mix, and you begin to see the full picture of discomfort. In an era with no modern hygiene products, navigating a period under multiple petticoats and a corset was its own quiet battle. Cloth pads, often pinned in place or held with sashes, were reused and discreetly managed by servants. Changing them required partial undressing, making it a once-a-day ordeal. Any leakage had to be swiftly concealed with perfume, fresh sachets, or, in worst cases, a hasty change of dress. And yet all of this was considered not just normal, but necessary. Women were praised for their fortitude and elegance despite the physical challenges. Queens were admired for standing through multi-hour ceremonies, dancing in ballrooms until sunrise, or appearing at public events without a single visible bead of sweat. One quirky anecdote involves Empress Elizabeth of Austria, also known as Sisi. A 19th century beauty icon, she was obsessed with maintaining a wasp waist, reportedly measuring just 19 inches. She exercised obsessively, starved herself, and wore corsets so tight that she fainted regularly. She even refused to pose for portraits after a certain age, terrified of being seen with so much as a wrinkle or crease. Behind her legendary beauty was an iron discipline, and a near constant state of physical suffering. Another fringe example comes from 17th century Sweden, where Queen Christina, famously eccentric and gender non-conforming, reportedly rebelled against these constricting fashions. She preferred looser, masculine clothing, and often shunned the corset altogether. Her wardrobe was a source of both scandal and admiration. She may have breathed more easily, but she paid a social price for her defiance. Today, we might look back and ask, why didn't they revolt? Why not demand comfort over corsets? But for most royal women, comfort was never the point. Their clothing was a symbol of station, wealth, and most importantly, control. A tight corset showed discipline. A sweat-free brow, despite the heat, signalled poise. Every bead, seam, and ribbon communicated something to the watching world. Historians often note that fashion is a mirror to culture, and the fashion of royal courts revealed a world where women were expected to appear composed while enduring extreme physical discomfort. The more elaborate the gown, the greater the sacrifice it required, and the greater the admiration it inspired. So the next time you see a regal portrait of a queen standing tall in shimmering satin, know this. Beneath that gown she was probably drenched, dizzy, and just barely holding it together. But she smiled anyway. Beneath the jewels, behind the powdered smiles, royal women often bore one burden they could not mask with lace or perfume: decaying teeth. In an age where sugar was both a luxury and a vice, and where dental hygiene was more guesswork than science, even the most radiant smile could be hiding a world of pain. The toothless grin wasn't a sign of aging. It was the silent echo of a royal diet, medical misunderstanding, and cosmetics trying to do damage control. Let's start with sugar, that sweet saboteur. In early modern Europe, sugar was a symbol of wealth and sophistication. Royal households consumed it in everything: tea, cakes, candied fruit, even meat glazes. It was powdered onto roasts, stirred into medicinal tonics, and sculpted into elaborate dessert displays known as subtleties. And royal women were expected not only to indulge but to host, showcasing their household's grandeur with sweet-laden feasts. Queen Elizabeth I, ever the trendsetter, was famously fond of sugar. Her teeth reportedly blackened over time, leading foreign ambassadors to assume that blackened teeth were a sign of English nobility. Some noble women, hoping to emulate her status, began blackening their own teeth artificially using charcoal or dyes. That's right, they pretended their teeth were rotting just to look elite. If that's not the ultimate sacrifice for status, what is? Tooth decay naturally followed. Without regular brushing, toothbrushes were rare and primitive, plaque built up quickly. Early efforts to clean the mouth included rubbing teeth with cloth dipped in vinegar or wine. Others used mixtures of honey, crushed eggshell, or burnt rosemary stems. Unfortunately, these practices were more abrasive than effective, stripping enamel, inflaming gums, and hastening the rot. When pain set in, and it always did, the royal remedy was extraction. But forget about anaesthetics or sterile tools. Teeth were yanked with iron pliers, often by barbers, not doctors. A screaming queen was not uncommon, and since dental records didn't exist, replacement teeth were a guessing game. Some were carved from ivory or wood, others repurposed from the mouths of soldiers or the poor. Imagine wearing someone else's molars, and doing so with grace at a banquet. Historians still argue whether the full extent of royal dental decay has been exaggerated in modern depictions. But first-hand accounts, letters, diaries, even paintings, offer undeniable clues. Closed-lip portraits, for instance, became increasingly common in later life. It wasn't modesty, it was damage control. Smiles were rare not because life was humourless, but because showing teeth was too revealing, too personal, and often too horrifying. The cosmetic response: enter the era of false teeth and black wax. Royal women used wax to fill gaps and reshape broken smiles. Black wax, in particular, was applied to disguise empty sockets, matching the darkened hue of other remaining teeth. It worked, sort of, but only in stillness. During meals or speeches, wax could melt or shift, a disaster in the making. One courtier even recorded an incident where a duchess's wax tooth slid down her lip mid-sentence, leading to a coughing fit and a quickly summoned handkerchief. Then there were the mints. Not the sweet breath fresheners we know today, but actual sprigs of mint and parsley, chewed throughout the day and stuffed discreetly into the corners of the mouth. The goal was to fight halitosis, another unavoidable symptom of decay. These sprigs also helped mask the odour of infected gums and abscesses, which were common and often left untreated until they became life-threatening. One fringe practice involved the use of urine as mouthwash. Yes, you read that correctly. Some medieval and early modern sources advised rinsing the mouth with stale urine to whiten teeth and freshen breath. It sounds appalling, and it was, but the ammonia in urine does have mild bleaching properties. The real horror lies in imagining a queen gargling before breakfast and then putting on a diamond necklace. Even more peculiar was the use of crushed coral or chalk as dental powder. These were rubbed onto teeth using small sticks wrapped in cloth. Again, abrasive and ultimately harmful. But at least it gave the illusion of effort. Dental hygiene was more about optics than outcome. One of the most famous examples of royal dental decline comes from France's Madame du Barry, Louis XV's final mistress. Celebrated for her beauty, she reportedly suffered from such severe tooth loss by her 30s that she avoided speaking at court functions. Her attempts to maintain her image involved elaborate fans, lace veils, and minimal movement of the mouth. Conversations became whispered, guarded, almost theatrical. But not all royals suffered in silence. Catherine the Great of Russia took a more direct approach. When plagued by dental issues, she imported German and English dentists, some of the best available at the time, to perform routine maintenance. Her personal diary includes entries about painful procedures, sometimes followed by days of seclusion. Still, even Catherine couldn't escape the limitations of 18th century dentistry. In portraits, her mouth is always closed, her expression dignified but distant. Another open debate among historians is whether these dental challenges affected royal policy. Did a monarch avoid public appearances due to mouth pain? Did toothache sour the mood during key negotiations? There's no direct evidence, but indirect clues abound. Cancelled meetings, unexplained travel delays, and sudden illnesses all appear with suspicious frequency in royal calendars. Even in love, teeth played a quiet, tragic role. Romantic letters sometimes mention the sweet scent of breath, a veiled compliment in an era when most mouths reeked of decay. Imagine a suitor complimenting you for not smelling like an open grave. That was romance, circa 1720. In a strange twist, some royal women sought to reclaim dental decay as a fashion statement. This culminated in the early 18th century trend of tooth gems, tiny jewels glued to the remaining teeth to distract from gaps. Diamonds, rubies, and pearls were affixed with wax or pitch. They didn't last long, but while they did, they sparkled at just the right angle. A smile became a spectacle, a distraction from the damage behind it. One amusing anecdote tells of an Italian princess whose diamond-studded tooth fell into her soup during a formal banquet. Rather than cause a scene, she calmly sipped her broth, retrieved the jewel with her tongue, and tucked it into her napkin. Not a drop of grace lost. But such moments were rare. Most royal women struggled daily with the limits of their mouths, cracking pain, infected roots, gum disease, all hidden behind painted lips and perfumed breath. And the cultural expectations never eased. The Queen's appearance had to be perfect. Her words had to flow gracefully. Her smile, even if missing half its original parts, had to enchant. So they adapted. They mastered the art of speaking softly, of using fans and glances to convey emotion. Some learned to eat only in private, declining meals at court functions. Others developed court smiles, closed lip expressions that suggested warmth without revealing the dental battlefield within. In some households, dentists were kept on retainer, much like musicians or portrait artists. They lived at court ready to extract, fill, or disguise at a moment's notice. Yet despite their presence, dental emergencies were still common and incredibly painful. infections from abscesses could spread quickly, causing fevers, swelling, and even death. And yet extractions were done without anaesthesia, often with prayers and biting sticks. By the 19th century, improvements in dental science began to trickle into royal life. Porcelain dentures, better cleaning tools, and the idea of regular checkups began to take root. Queen Victoria herself owned several sets of false teeth and kept detailed notes on their maintenance, but even she admitted, in private letters, that she dreaded dental appointments more than childbirth. Today, we take for granted the ability to smile without fear, to brush without pain, to chew without calculation. But for centuries, royal women bore their dental afflictions in silence, crafting a performance around each word and each bite. They smiled not because they felt joy, but because they had no choice. Behind every powdered cheek and painted lip was a struggle as personal as it was painful. And when they finally removed their wax, their herbs, their gems at the end of the day, what remained wasn't just a mouth. It was a map of what it cost to rule, to please, and above all to appear perfect. Royal medicine in the pre-modern world was an uneasy cocktail of superstition, guesswork, and a disturbing enthusiasm for bodily fluids. Behind palace walls, the treatment for nearly every ailment, headaches, fatigue, skin rashes, even emotional distress, boiled down to one of the most enduring and bloodiest medical rituals in history: bloodletting. And yes, royal women participated, sometimes eagerly, in these draining endeavours, convinced that balance, not cleanliness, was the key to health. To understand why queens and princesses willingly open their veins, we need to enter the world of the four humours. This ancient theory, first popularised by Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, held that the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on their balance. Illness was the result of excess or deficiency. This logic reigned supreme for over 1,000 years, and blood, being the most visible and seemingly abundant of the four, often took the blame when something went wrong. A royal woman with a fever, too much blood. Melancholy or mood swings, also too much blood. Skin eruptions, probably blood again, perhaps mixed with corrupted humours from the liver. The solution? Let it out. Bloodletting wasn't done casually. It was a procedure with rules, tools and ceremony. Royal physicians used ornate lancets, small, sharp blades often encrusted with gems or engraved with crests. The chosen site for bleeding varied: the arm, the foot, sometimes the neck. Women were typically bled from the inner elbow or wrist. A bowl was placed below, marked with lines to measure the quantity: 4 ounces for fatigue, 6 for fever, 8 for hysteria. Even more delicately balanced were the timings. Astrology played a role. Certain phases of the moon were deemed more favourable for bloodletting. Specific days of the week were believed to influence results. A queen might be advised to wait until Thursday to drain liver heat, or avoid bleeding during Mercury's retrograde lest it invite madness. This was medicine laced with horoscopes. Of course, if the idea of slicing into a royal limb seems too jarring, there was always the more aristocratic alternative: leeches. These squirming little doctors were considered gentler and more refined. Ladies of the court could recline on velvet cushions while their physicians applied leeches to their temples, ankles, or even behind the ears. The sensation? Cold, wet, then slightly numbing as the leech did its work. Leeches, for all their creep factor, were strangely popular. In 17th century France, apothecaries kept them in glass jars like pets, feeding them milk-soaked cloths and marketing them by size and temperament. Royal women often had their own personal leech kits, complete with embroidered cloths and silver tongs. Some noble women even named their favourite leeches, an oddly intimate bond with something that fed on their blood. Yet the effects were rarely beneficial. Blood loss led to dizziness, weakness, and fainting spells. Combined with corsets, malnutrition, and chronic menstruation, the cumulative result was often anemia. Royal women paled not from elegance but from literal lack of blood. Still, they returned for more, because the prevailing belief was not in bacteria or immunity, but in purging. Royal physicians prescribed regular bleeding as a preventive measure. Some queens were bled monthly, others seasonally. A few unfortunate souls underwent dozens of sessions per year. Catherine de' Medici, already burdened by political intrigue, reportedly submitted to bloodletting multiple times during each pregnancy in hopes of warding off complications. And it wasn't just about illness. Emotional states were medicalized too. Sadness, anger, and even boredom were attributed to overheated blood or stagnant humours. So if a duchess wept too much, or seemed agitated during court, she might find herself in her chambers the next morning with a warm cloth, a bowl, and a blade. The obsession with balance extended beyond blood. Enemas were a close second in popularity, especially for women whose digestion was disrupted by rich court feasts and sedentary lifestyles. Enemas, or clysters as they were called, were often administered by servants using long decorated syringes made from glass or ivory. The process involved lying on one side while a solution, typically herbal water or warm oil, was injected rectally. Humbling, yes, but also considered essential. There are records of noblewomen requesting specific clyster recipes: lavender for relaxation, chamomile for cramps, sage for melancholy. Some even held court while undergoing these treatments, seated behind curtains or throne commodes, designed to allow for discreet evacuation. The layers of propriety were thin but heavily perfumed. One particularly absurd ritual was the sweat cure. Popular in Germany and Austria, this involved wrapping the patient in heavy blankets soaked with mustard or vinegar and placing them near a roaring fire. The goal was to induce intense perspiration, forcing the bad humours out through the skin. For royal women already confined by corsets and fur-lined gowns, the experience must have been excruciating. Yet they endured, believing each drop of sweat was a step closer to equilibrium. Historians still argue whether royal women genuinely believed in these cures or simply obeyed the medical authorities around them. Given their education, often limited to etiquette and languages, it's likely many accepted whatever the physicians decreed. But some pushed back. Letters from 18th century noblewomen show a growing skepticism toward bleeding and purging, especially as Enlightenment ideas spread. "They drained me again today," wrote one countess, "and I swear I felt no better, only emptier." Of course, superstition still held strong. One fringe belief was that menstrual blood itself was poisonous, capable of withering flowers and clouding mirrors. This led to bizarre practices like secluding menstruating women or using monthly cloths as talismans to ward off disease, either burned, buried, or, in rare cases, worn in amulets. The royal menstrual cycle was a subject of great interest, especially when succession was at stake. Physicians would monitor the queen's cycles closely, sometimes using the absence of blood as a pregnancy indicator. Others interpreted irregular bleeding as a sign of divine disfavour. One French astrologer famously warned Marie de Medici that her womb was too damp for viable heirs, a diagnosis that sounds ridiculous now but was taken seriously then. And then there were the fertility rituals. Some women drank concoctions of wine, ground pearls, and animal liver to stimulate conception. Others were advised to bathe in goat's milk or hold warm stones against their abdomen. A few even participated in full moon ceremonies, lying in gardens to absorb lunar energy. Medical science was barely distinguishable from witchcraft. One darkly humorous tale comes from Russia, where a noblewoman suffering from melancholia was advised to wear a necklace made from dried bat hearts. She did so for weeks, reporting no improvement, except in how often she was avoided at court. Despite all this, many royal women survived into old age, but not without scars. Repeated bloodletting caused collapsed veins, anemia, and sometimes internal bleeding. One Polish princess bled so often she could no longer stand, was carried to court functions on a silk litter, her lips painted red to disguise their natural pallor. Leeches too left their marks. The suction sites could scar or become infected, leading to painful abscesses. Yet the sight of a woman calmly allowing a parasite to drink from her temple was considered noble, a sign of patience, resilience, and trust in the system. Open scholarly debate still surrounds the motivations behind these treatments. Were they rooted in genuine belief, male control, ritualistic performance, or all of the above? Some historians argue that the medical abuse of royal women served to keep them weak, docile, and dependent. Others see it as a cultural blind spot, an era doing the best it could with the tools it had. Whatever the truth, the image endures. A queen reclining on velvet cushions, her wrist outstretched, a silver bowl below. Not a drop of complaint, not a flicker of resistance. Just another sacrifice to the god of balance. So the next time someone recommends a juice cleanse, remember, it could be worse. You could be drained by leeches named after saints while wearing a corset and sipping pearl wine under the full moon. In the rarefied world of royal courts, where every accessory whispered of status and sophistication, there was one item that carried more than a hint of mystery: perfumed gloves. Silken, scented, and delicately embroidered, these gloves were far more than just fashion statements. For royal women, they were symbols of refinement, tools of seduction, shields against foul air, and, on occasion, instruments of death. Perfumed gloves first gained prominence in Renaissance Europe, particularly in Italy, Spain, and France. Tanners and glove makers, attempting to disguise the unpleasant smell of processed leather, began soaking gloves in fragrant oils: jasmine, rose, amber, or orange blossom. Over time, this evolved into an art form. Gloves were lined with crushed herbs, steeped in floral waters, and packed into boxes with layers of potpourri. The result? A pair of gloves that not only looked elegant but emitted an intoxicating scent with every flick of the wrist. Royal women adored them. In an era when sanitation was minimal and odours were omnipresent, scented gloves provided a portable bubble of beauty. Slipping on a perfumed glove allowed a duchess or queen to mask the scent of chamber pots, unwashed courtiers, or, frankly, herself. It was both defence and offence in the olfactory battleground of the palace. But these gloves did more than mask reality. They became intimate extensions of courtly flirtation. A lady might remove a glove slowly during conversation, releasing a puff of fragrance meant to captivate. If she handed a glove to a suitor, it was more than a gift. It was a tactile, scented token of favour. The perfume lingered on his fingers, on his neck, maybe even in his dreams. Yet within this delicate accessory lurked a far darker possibility: poison. By the 16th century, rumours of death gloves began circulating through European courts. These were gloves laced not only with perfume but with toxic compounds: arsenic, belladonna, or powdered mercury. The idea was that the poison would be absorbed through the skin or inhaled in small doses until the victim weakened, sickened, or died. One of the most whispered cases involved the Queen of Navarre, Jeanne d'Albret, mother of the future King Henry IV of France. A fierce Protestant leader in a time of Catholic dominance, Jeanne was said to have died suddenly after trying on a pair of perfumed gloves gifted to her by Catherine de' Medici. Historians still debate whether this tale is fact or fiction. The symptoms of Jeanne's sudden illness, vomiting, pain, and rapid decline, certainly raised suspicions, and Catherine, a known patron of astrologers and alchemists, didn't do much to dispel the whispers. Another famous case, perhaps more urban legend than fact, involves an Italian noblewoman who had her gloves laced with belladonna and wolfsbane, intending to seduce and slowly dispatch a rival lover. The poison caused hallucinations, tremors, and eventual collapse. Whether the story is true or embroidered over centuries of retelling, the idea stuck. A glove could both caress and kill. But even without intentional poisoning, scented gloves posed risks. Many of the perfumes used contained compounds we now know to be toxic: lead acetate, mercury salts, and animal musk. Extended skin contact, especially on hands with small cuts or delicate tissue, allowed these substances to enter the bloodstream. Royal women who wore gloves daily for hours, especially in hot weather, exposed themselves to a steady, low-level cocktail of toxins. And the danger wasn't limited to gloves. Other scented accessories joined the ensemble. Perfumed fans, scented ribbons, and tiny pomanders hung on belts or tucked into bodices. Pomanders were often filled with ambergris, musk, or spices, and while they masked smells admirably, they also absorbed body heat and released concentrated fumes close to the face. In confined palace rooms with poor ventilation, this meant royal women were often marinating in a fragrant but noxious cloud of chemicals. One fringe accessory was the glove fan, the combination of the two most aromatic items in a lady's arsenal. These were gloves that included small folding fans at the wrist, allowing the wearer to waft scented air toward her own face or toward a companion. Beautiful? Yes. Practical? Only if you weren't allergic to any of the 15 ingredients stewing in the fabric. Historians point out that these accessories were not just fashion items, but part of a broader medical philosophy. At the time, people believed that disease travelled through miasmas, bad air that carried illness. By wearing perfumed gloves or fans, royal women were, in their view, warding off disease. A sweet smell wasn't just a social asset, it was armour. This belief extended to the glove-making process itself. Gloves were sometimes cured in vinegar, wine or urine to soften the leather and increase absorbency for perfume. These liquids were believed to purify the material, but they also left behind residues that could irritate skin or trigger allergic reactions. It's no wonder that royal women often developed rashes or blisters on their wrists and forearms, though these were often blamed on bad humours or stress. In one oddly charming yet tragic anecdote, a Spanish princess developed such a severe sensitivity to her favourite violet-scented gloves that she continued to wear them anyway, suffering rashes and swelling rather than switch to a less luxurious scent. Her letters complain of the itch that arrives with elegance, a poetic euphemism for contact dermatitis. Despite the risks, perfumed gloves remained staples of royal wardrobes well into the 18th century. They were given as diplomatic gifts, exchanged during courtship, and even buried with noblewomen as symbols of purity and refinement. Some gloves were embroidered with secret messages or names, visible only under certain light. Others included hidden pockets for love notes or charms. These were wearable diaries, private, fragrant, and deeply personal. Even their storage was a ritual. Royal gloves were kept in perfumed drawers, often alongside sachets of dried rose petals or crushed clove. Special glove boxes, carved from cedar or sandalwood, ensured the scent lingered long after use. Some women rotated gloves weekly, not to clean them, because gloves were rarely washed, but to give the fabric time to rest and reabsorb its scent from the drawer. One bizarre but real trend involved glove boiling. If a scent began to fade, some women would steam their gloves over pots of scented water, letting the fabric absorb new fragrance without ever getting scrubbed. This method was less about hygiene than olfactory maintenance. The gloves might remain stained and crusty from months of use, but as long as they smelled divine, they were considered ready for court. Open scholarly debate continues around how many royal deaths can truly be attributed to poisoned gloves or scented accessories. For every dramatic tale, there's a counter-argument grounded in coincidence, bad diet, or poor hygiene. But the idea of weaponized beauty, of turning fashion into a tool of manipulation or murder, remains one of history's most irresistible narratives. And in truth, the glove was always more than a glove. It was an extension of persona, an object of intrigue, and sometimes a trap. It could express affection or deliver death. It could shield a hand from filth or carry that filth disguised in florals. Today, scented gloves are a relic of history, more costume than necessity. But they remind us of an age when touch, scent, and appearance were all tightly choreographed in the dangerous dance of royal life. When slipping on a glove meant entering the stage, fully costumed, slightly perfumed, and never entirely safe. So the next time you put on your lotion or spritz a bit of fragrance, take a moment to appreciate the safety of modern beauty. No poison, no parasites, just the faint memory of a duchess with a gloved hand, waving coyly across the ballroom, her fingertips whispering secrets no one dared to repeat. Long before toothpaste and antiseptic rinses lined our shelves, royal women resorted to far stranger solutions to freshen their breath. While their gowns sparkled and their wigs defied gravity, their oral hygiene relied on concoctions that would make a modern dentist recoil. From vinegar elixirs to flat-out shocking ingredients, the quest for a sweet-smelling mouth was a bizarre blend of desperation and misplaced optimism, leading to the unforgettable chapter of hygiene history known as the mouthwash of vinegar and urine. Yes, you read that right. Urine. Let's set the stage. A dimly lit chamber somewhere in 16th century Europe. A queen sits at her ornate vanity, delicately swirling a golden goblet filled with amber liquid. To the untrained eye, it might look like a fine dessert wine, but it isn't. It's a homemade blend of white wine vinegar, crushed mint leaves, rosemary, and a healthy splash of her own morning urine. This was not a prank. This was routine. Urine, particularly the first void of the day, was believed to have antiseptic properties. Ancient Roman and later medieval physicians argued that urine's ammonia content could whiten teeth, fight plaque, and even treat gum disease. These ideas, passed down through manuscripts and mouth-to-mouth advice, stuck around well into the Renaissance. In some royal households there were designated collection pots, reserved just for this purpose, one for the chamber pot, one for the rinse cup. Most noblemen preferred to dilute it, mixing with rosewater or aromatic herbs to soften the blow. But make no mistake, this was not an accidental practice. It was advised by apothecaries, prescribed by court physicians, and even discussed in letters. A 17th century duchess once wrote to her sister, "The wine of my morning self does cure the ache of tooth and frightens away the rot." Frightens away the rot. If only it were that simple. Vinegar, while far less scandalous, had its own downsides. It was acidic enough to strip away plaque, but also eroded enamel with prolonged use. Still, vinegar rinses were favoured for their cleansing power and their refreshing burn. They were typically steeped with herbs, clove to numb pain, sage for scent, and thyme as a supposed disinfectant. These mixtures were gargled loudly and with flourish, often during morning toilette when courtiers wandered in and out bearing gossip and invitations. One especially popular variant was a mix of red wine vinegar, crushed cinnamon bark and honey. It sounds almost drinkable, until you remember its purpose. The goal wasn't sweetness, but sterilisation. Some women believed that swishing such a mixture kept not only bad breath at bay, but also evil spirits, bad dreams, and courtly slander. A fresh mouth, after all, was believed to reflect a pure heart, and yet these treatments rarely did what they were supposed to do. Beneath the herbal infusions and sharp scents lurked a mouth suffering from decay. Cavities were rampant, gums frequently bled, and infections brewed quietly under neglected molars. Gargling with vinegar might ease the pain temporarily, but it didn't solve the deeper issues worsened by sugar-rich diets and poor dental care. Royal kitchens, always brimming with desserts, didn't help matters. Candied violets, sugared almonds, honey-glazed meats, and endless pastries made for beautiful banquets, and disastrous teeth. Queens were expected to nibble delicately during state dinners, but behind closed doors, many indulged freely. Sugar was a sign of wealth. The more, the better. Some royal women tried to offset the damage with chewed herbs. Parsley, cardamom pods, fennel seeds, chewed after meals to clean the breath and supposedly scrape the teeth. These created fleeting freshness, but also left bits behind, which could worsen decay over time. Ever the perfectionist, some noblewomen kept silver toothpicks at the ready, dainty tools that doubled as status symbols. In some portraits, these picks are visible tucked into jewelled cases worn at the hip. Tooth powders were another line of defence. Made from a mix of ground eggshells, pumice, burnt bread, and sometimes chalk or coral, these gritty substances were rubbed onto the teeth with linen cloth or small brushes made of hog bristle. The process was abrasive and uncomfortable, but it polished the teeth, temporarily. It also wore away enamel and left teeth vulnerable to infection. Many powders were heavily perfumed, not to please the mouth, but to mask the decay behind it. One fringe remedy involved rubbing ashes of burnt rosemary on the gums to reduce swelling. Others used powdered sage mixed with honey. Some recipes called for baking crushed pearls into a paste, a costly abrasive treatment that added glamour to the agony. And then there were the extremes. At one particularly extravagant French court, a noblewoman was said to rinse her mouth daily with a mixture of rosewater and powdered gold. Not only did it glisten in the morning light, but she believed it imbued her with heavenly breath. More likely, it lightened her purse and worsened her sensitivity. Historians remain sceptical but amused. Powdered gold has no known benefit for oral hygiene, just for legend-making. Another bizarre trend arose in the Spanish court. Mouth rinsing with warm goat's milk infused with marjoram. The milk was thought to nourish the gums and soften any brewing abscesses. Unsurprisingly, this led to more sour breath than sweet, and yet it caught on as a short-lived fashion among court ladies trying to avoid vinegar's sting. The open scholarly debate among historians today is whether these women genuinely believed in these treatments or whether they simply went through the motions to uphold courtly appearance. After all, image was everything. A queen couldn't afford to offend a visiting diplomat with foul breath. And so, even if the cure stung or reeked or made her gag, she would rinse, spit, smile, and glide into court like nothing was amiss. Yet sometimes, even court etiquette cracked under the weight of these habits. Imagine a ballroom swirling with powdered wigs and perfume when suddenly a duchess leans in for a whispered comment, and her breath wafts with a mix of vinegar, cloves, and something earthier. The listener would smile tightly, nod politely, and try not to inhale too deeply. After all, to offend a high-ranking lady by recoiling would be a grave faux pas. In response, perfumed handkerchiefs became ever more vital. Ladies held them close to their faces, pretending to sniff or wipe at a tear, when in reality they were shielding themselves from the scent war unfolding around them. These kerchiefs were doused in rose or violet essence, and often embroidered with initials and symbols of courtly love. Their flutter was part of court choreography, their purpose deeply practical. It wasn't all bleak. Some royal women began pushing for better dental knowledge. In the 18th century, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria commissioned a physician to study tooth decay among her children. Queen Charlotte of England encouraged the use of dental scrapers, and even Catherine the Great kept imported toothbrushes from England, though they were more novelty than necessity. But real progress was slow. Vinegar rinses and herbal chews remained the norm well into the 19th century, long after they'd been proven ineffective. It wasn't until modern germ theory and dental hygiene spread that the idea of cleanliness replaced mere fragrance as the goal. Still, for centuries, royal women did what they could. They rinsed, gargled, chewed, powdered and smiled, carefully. And when the mouthwash didn't work, they relied on wit, perfume and distance. After all, nothing says royal poise like delivering a diplomatic insult with a sweet smile and a discreet sprig of mint tucked in your cheek. Beneath the illusion of regal elegance, behind the silk hangings and golden trim, lay one of the most ironic truths of royal life. Bathing, that cornerstone of hygiene and refreshment, was often communal, rare, and disturbingly unsanitary. Shared baths, when they happened, were seldom scrubbed, and in many courts they became places not for cleansing, but for conversation, ritual, and the occasional awkward encounter with a floating rose petal that wasn't a rose petal. Let's start with the basic fact. Bathtubs were luxury items. While we might picture clawfoot porcelain tubs gleaming in candlelight, most early bathing vessels resembled oversized wooden barrels lined with fabric or leather. Some were made of pewter or copper, expensive and prone to rust. Others were little more than glorified washtubs. The fancier ones had padded edges for comfort. None had plumbing. The water, carried in by servants, buckets and buckets of it, boiled over hearths and poured carefully into the tub. By the time it was full, the water was lukewarm at best, and that was the best-case scenario. Refilling the tub meant reheating more water, so once it was drawn, that same bath water was used by more than one person. Often, many more. Royal households operated on a sort of informal pecking order. The Queen bathed first, followed by her ladies-in-waiting in descending rank. If the Queen's children were present, they might go next, then other relatives, and so on. By the end of the line, the water was cloudy, cooled, and more symbolic than useful. And yet, etiquette demanded participation. Declining to bathe could be seen as rebellion or aloofness, so everyone stepped in, smiled, and tried not to dwell on what was floating by. This wasn't unique to one region. In France, England, Austria, and Spain, shared bathing practices were the norm. Even in the Ottoman harem, with its famously luxurious marble baths, water was reused, and scrubbing the tub between uses was not standard. The idea of scrubbing, in fact, was not widely embraced. Soap was precious, often perfumed and reserved for specific parts of the body, usually the hands and face. Full-body scrubs, rare. Part of this reluctance stemmed from the belief that bathing, particularly in hot water, opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. Cold water, conversely, was thought to harden the constitution. Some women bathed only in cold water to avoid the faintness associated with warmth. Others swore by milk baths, popularised by legends of Cleopatra, though these often involved sour or diluted milk and were more about scent and status than sanitation. One fringe account from the Habsburg court tells of a duchess who bathed once a month in red wine, believing it tightened the skin and preserved youth. She insisted that the wine be room temperature and stirred with rose petals. After her soak, the servants were ordered to bottle the bath water and dispose of it far from the palace, though rumours say a few bottles were sold to hopeful commoners looking for a hint of nobility's glow. In most royal homes, bath time was not private. Curtains or screens might be drawn, but the presence of servants, musicians, and sometimes family was expected. Bathing was a social ritual, sometimes even a political one. Guests might be invited to observe, not in a scandalous way, but as part of a ceremony demonstrating health, fertility, or wealth. Bathing rooms were often adjacent to gardens or terraces, designed to blend the experience with nature. Birds chirped, roses bloomed, and somewhere under it all, a foot grazed someone else's forgotten loofah. The water itself was often steeped with herbs, petals, or oils, lavender and chamomile for calm, rose and orange blossom for scent, sage and rosemary for supposed purification. But these additions didn't cleanse, they masked. The underlying water, once used, stayed used, and without drainage systems, emptying the tub involved scooping it out bucket by bucket. Another reason to postpone scrubbing or refilling. Bath linens, too, were more decorative than functional. Towels were embroidered, perfumed, and occasionally starched, but they were not absorbent. Many royal women dried themselves by standing near a fire or being fanned while lightly dabbed with cloths. Sometimes they simply air-dried. On colder days, this led to shivering, chattering teeth, and in some cases a resigned shuffle back to the warmth of heavy gowns. One infamous mishap took place during the reign of Louis XV. A visiting duchess, unfamiliar with the etiquette of the French court, mistakenly assumed her bath would be private. She undressed, settled in, and was midway through scrubbing her arms when 3 noblewomen entered the room, gowns billowing, fans in hand, prepared for conversation. The duchess, mortified, attempted to cover herself with rose petals to no avail. From that day forward she refused to bathe in court, becoming known as Madame Marais or Lady Tide, in mocking reference to the tidal wave of gossip that followed. Despite the discomfort, royal women couldn't escape bathing completely. Certain occasions required it: weddings, coronations, post-childbirth rituals. In many cultures, a bath before consummation was considered essential, though again, more symbolic than sanitary. Some brides were rubbed with scented oils and lightly scrubbed with pumice or dried herbs by their attendants, a ritual meant to cleanse the body and spirit. And still, no one changed the water. In Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth I had a custom-built wooden bath at Richmond Palace, lined with velvet cushions and perfumed cloths. She reportedly bathed once a month, a frequency that earned her the reputation of being obsessively clean. In comparison to her peers, she may well have been. Her bathwater was steeped with thyme, marjoram, and lemon peel. Servants sang softly while pouring the water, a soothing soundtrack to an otherwise tepid soak. Catherine de' Medici was another known enthusiast of elaborate bathing. Her bath chamber was decorated with marble statues and copper basins. She believed strongly in the power of scented water to ward off illness, and frequently consulted her astrologers about the best days to bathe. Despite her diligence, her baths were never solitary. There are accounts of entire conversations about court policy conducted from behind a linen screen, with Catherine submerged in rose-scented water while nobles discussed taxation. The irony? These women rarely emerged from a bath cleaner than they entered. The grime of others, the lack of soap and the stagnant water meant that many baths were more of a perfumed rinse than a thorough cleanse, and once the ritual was complete, the body was immediately sealed again in layers of unwashed fabric, tightened corsets, and scented gloves. Open scholarly debate lingers around how widespread bathing truly was among royal women. Some argue that the records are exaggerated, that the average queen bathed far less than we think. Others believe that bath culture was more vibrant, just less documented. But one thing's clear: cleanliness wasn't the point. Bathing was performance, it was theatre, a way to display wealth, sensuality and control over nature, even if nature was floating gently in the corner of the tub. One curious legacy of this era is the lingering association of rosewater with cleanliness. Today we associate floral scents with hygiene, but in royal courts they were tools of concealment. The idea wasn't to remove odour, but to overpower it. You didn't clean the tub, you added more petals. You didn't scrub the skin, you masked it with oils. The result? A beautifully scented illusion of purity. Even after plumbing began to modernise, the rituals remained. Bathing slowly became more private, more hygienic and less communal. But the idea of perfume over purity lingered for generations, and for some royal women, even the introduction of showers and flush toilets was met with suspicion. Wasn't there danger in too much water? Didn't open pores invite melancholy vapours? So the next time you light a candle, fill your tub with bubbles and pour yourself a drink for a relaxing soak, consider the queens who came before you. Their baths were crowded, their water stale, their privacy non-existent. They bathed under scrutiny, soaked in symbolism, and emerged not refreshed but simply rescented. And above all, they did it with a straight face and a delicate cough. because nothing screams royal composure like pretending not to notice the 6 other people waiting to take your place in the same bathwater. In the meticulous world of royal hygiene, or lack thereof, perhaps nothing demonstrates the complex layers of status, appearance, and denial better than the role of chambermaids. These women, often overlooked in historical accounts, were essential to the daily performance of royal cleanliness, and yet their very presence reveals the peculiar paradox of aristocratic hygiene. Royal women may have glowed with perfume and pearls, but many never actually touched water. Instead, they relied on others to do the washing, or at least the wiping. The phrase eau de chambermaid might sound like a French perfume. In reality, it was a kind of olfactory shorthand for the blend of floral waters, body odour and human labour that defined the hygiene of noblewomen from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The chambermaid was the intermediary between the royal body and cleanliness, tasked with dabbing, perfuming, wiping, and occasionally even powdering her mistress, not to clean her, but to keep her fresh enough for public life. Morning toilette was a ritual, choreographed down to the last spritz. A royal woman did not rise and wash her face at a basin. She was awakened by gentle knocks and soft murmurs. Then, still reclining or perched on a velvet stool, she was attended by several women, each with a specific role. One held the linen cloths, another managed the aromatic waters, a third applied the powders and rouge, while a fourth, often the most trusted, handled more intimate duties. Actual bathing, rare. The chambermaid's role was to maintain the illusion of cleanliness. This involved a system known as dry washing. Using soft cloth soaked in scented water or diluted wine, she would wipe the queen's face, neck, underarms, and other selected areas, though never all at once. Too much cleaning was thought to weaken the body or strip away protective oils. Instead, the chambermaid rotated areas of attention, sometimes skipping days entirely for certain regions. A truly spotless queen was more mythical than real, and this, of course, was not without its consequences. Skin irritation was common. Oils and perfumes built up, mixing with sweat and dirt to create what could generously be called a regal sheen. Yet few dared complain. To say the queen needed a real wash was to risk one's position, or worse, one's head. The chambermaid's role was to maintain illusion, not to challenge it. One particularly vivid account comes from the court of Maria Theresa. Each morning, her chambermaids would bring in a series of bowls filled with rosewater and diluted milk. Her hands and feet were gently dabbed, followed by her neck and temples. A separate servant aired her undergarments by the window, shaking them to remove dust, but not washing them. The garments were then reperfumed, sometimes with sachets of crushed lavender or orange peel, and redressed onto her without any laundering in between. Underclothes, like shifts and chemises, were considered protective barriers between the body and the more valuable outer garments. Since they were made of linen and usually plain, they were expected to absorb sweat. However, they were also believed to purify themselves if aired properly. Sunlight, wind, and perfume were the primary cleaning agents. In many royal households, underclothes were worn for days, if not weeks, before being properly washed, and even then only lightly rinsed. Boiling or scrubbing was thought to weaken the fibres. For chambermaids, this presented a constant battle between duty and decency. One English maid wrote in her private journal that she was ordered to wipe milady's underarms with a cloth steeped in eau de cologne, though I found them not untouched by the summer heat. Her words are polite, but the message is clear. The royal body was not immune to odour. It simply had better tools to conceal it. These maids, while subservient, held immense unspoken power. They knew the secrets of the body, where the rashes were, which perfumes masked certain odours, when their mistress's cycle began or ended. They were trusted to handle stains, infections, and eruptions with discretion. In some cases, they were the only people who ever truly saw the royal woman unmasked. Her face without powder, her body without corsets, her breath without cloves. And yet the maids were not equals. They were often forbidden from bathing in the same facilities, or wearing the same perfumes. One fringe rule at Versailles barred chambermaids from using rosewater, unless it was the diluted second pressing, the first being reserved for the nobility. Maids were expected to be invisible, scentless, and silent. Despite this, some chambermaids rose to power and influence. Madame Campan, a trusted attendant to Marie Antoinette, later published memoirs that reveal the intimate details of court hygiene. She described the Queen's morning routine as a ceremony, involving not just maids but ladies of rank who competed for the honour of passing her clothing or jewellery. In this odd hierarchy, a duchess might hand the Queen her chemise, while a chambermaid dabbed her arms with lemon water. Sometimes, though, the lines blurred. A royal woman, especially one in poor health, might rely entirely on a favoured maid for all bodily care. Bathing, grooming, dressing, even tending to infections. These maids became confidants, healers, and, in rare cases, spies. Letters reveal that rival courts sometimes bribed chambermaids for information, knowing they were the closest observers of a queen's private life. But being close also meant being vulnerable. If a mistress fell from favour, her maid often went down with her, and if illness struck, it was the chambermaid who first witnessed the sores, the fevers, the smells, long before the physicians arrived. One tragic example comes from the Spanish court, where a young maid tending to a syphilitic duchess contracted the disease through open wounds on her hands. She died quietly, buried without ceremony. Her name appears only once in the household ledger, next to a charge for a pair of gloves. The gloves, of course, were not just fashion. They were protection. Many chambermaids wore them while working, especially when applying ointments or washing intimate areas. The gloves were washed more frequently than the linens, perhaps the only items in the royal wardrobe to receive regular cleaning. There's an open, scholarly debate about how much autonomy chambermaids had in improving hygiene. Some argue they were simply tools, following orders and reinforcing outdated practices. Others suggest they were quiet reformers, encouraging discreet rinsing, adding extra cloths, substituting gentler herbs, or using more water than officially permitted. In this view, they were the unsung heroines of hygiene, labouring against a system that prized appearances over actual cleanliness. And yet, their efforts could only go so far. Royal women, taught from birth to avoid excessive washing, clung to ritual over reason. A bath might be suggested but declined. A rash might be powdered rather than treated. The chambermaid's cloth did not cleanse, it performed. And the performance, in velvet-draped bedrooms and gilded boudoir, was flawless. One particularly poignant record details the death of an aging queen. In her final days, unable to stand or eat, she was attended only by her most loyal chambermaid. The physicians had left. The courtiers were gone. But the maid remained, gently wiping her hands with rose water, combing her hair, and applying a final dab of lavender behind each ear. It wasn't for the queen. It was for the memory of who she had been, for the illusion she had carried, and the woman who had helped her carry it. Today we might marvel at the luxuries of royal life, silk sheets, perfumed gowns, gilded mirrors, but none of it functioned without the quiet labour of those who stood in the background. The chambermaid didn't just dress the queen. She preserved her myth. She created the scent, the softness, the illusion of cleanliness. And when the court applauded the queen's elegance, it was, in some small way, also a bow to the woman behind the curtain, dabbing a cloth against tired skin, whispering that all was well and making sure it smelled like roses. Of all the hush-hush topics in royal history, nothing was guarded more tightly, literally and figuratively, than menstruation. Cloaked in secrecy, swaddled in cloth, and whispered about in euphemisms, the monthly cycle of queens and noblewomen was a biological certainty wrapped in layers of social shame, awkward rituals, and sometimes painful improvisation. There were no tampons, no pads with wings, no heating pads for cramps, just creative solutions, stiff upper lips, and chambermaids who knew when to knock twice. In the candlelit palaces of Europe, a royal woman's period was something she never spoke of, but which quietly shaped every aspect of her routine. Her wardrobe, her movement, her hygiene habits, even her court appearances were altered to accommodate that time of the month, and the tools she had to manage it. Nothing more than folded cloth, layers of linen, and a whole lot of perfume. The earliest form of period protection among noblewomen was the menstrual rag, a strip of linen folded and pinned to underclothes using ties or sashes. These cloths were handmade, reused, and often hand-washed by chambermaids in absolute secrecy. In royal households, it wasn't uncommon for several sets to be prepared in advance and rotated through discrete laundry cycles. The cloths were frequently perfumed with herbs like lavender or rose petals, not for aesthetics, but to mask the inevitable scent. These rags were worn like makeshift diapers. Under a chemise and perhaps 2 or 3 layers of petticoats, a royal woman would tie or pin the cloth snugly between her legs, often anchoring it to a waistband of sorts. It was bulky, it chafed, and it shifted when walking. During long ceremonies, women sat stiffly to avoid displacing it. Some developed rashes or even infections from prolonged wear, and there was no such thing as spares on hand. If a leak occurred mid-banquet or during a court dance, the options were limited. Retreat discreetly, change linens, repowder, reperfume, and return, smiling as if nothing had happened. If the stain reached outer garments, strategic folding of fans, artful cloak drapes, and trusted ladies-in-waiting became essential. In some courts, menstruation was treated as an illness. Women were expected to rest, avoid certain foods, and abstain from religious ceremonies. The logic stemmed from ancient medical theories that considered menstrual blood not only toxic but spiritually unclean. In Catholic royal courts, this meant a queen on her period couldn't take communion or enter the more sacred areas of the chapel. In Protestant circles, rules were looser, but the stigma remained. One of the oddest side effects of this cultural taboo was the euphemism overload. Rather than say the word outright, royal women and their households developed elaborate code phrases. She has retired to her red chamber. She's observing her quiet days. The rose garden is blooming. Letters and diaries are filled with these poetic dodges, leaving historians to decipher context like cryptologists. In some parts of Europe, particularly among the French aristocracy, a more ambitious solution emerged, the menstruating girdle. This was a padded belt-like garment worn over the hips, with slots for cloth inserts. Think of it as an early period belt. Some were lined with silk or satin, others with absorbent wools, and in royal circles they were often embroidered, scented, and stored in ornate boxes. Function met fashion, however questionably. Still, accidents happened. One Spanish noblewoman in the court of Philip II reportedly fainted during a formal procession, not from illness, but from heat and panic upon discovering that her menstrual cloth had slipped, staining her petticoat. She was whisked away by her maids, the procession halted for heatstroke, and the story quietly buried. But word leaked, and for years the phrase "don't trip in crimson" became a whispered warning among court ladies. For royal girls, menstruation was more than a biological milestone, it was a political one. Getting one's period marked eligibility for marriage. At that moment, a young archduchess or princess went from playing with miniatures to being fitted for bridal gowns and discussed in international treaties. Entire kingdoms hinged on whether a 13-year-old had started bleeding, and once she had, the court began charting her cycle, not just for health, but for reproductive planning. The pressure to conceive soon after marriage was immense. Royal doctors paid close attention to the Queen's menstrual patterns, using them to calculate fertility windows. If a period was late, celebrations or anxiety followed. If it came too early or too frequently, medical treatments were prescribed, ranging from herbal teas to bleeding or uterine fumigation, which involved exposing the lower abdomen to scented smoke. Yes, really. Historians still debate how effective these methods were, if they had any effect at all. But the records are clear. Menstruation wasn't just private, it was state business. Failure to conceive could doom a queen's reputation, and rumours of infertility were sometimes spread by rivals hoping to undermine her political position. One fringe practice from Eastern European courts involved soaking menstrual cloths in red wine and burning them as a fertility ritual. Another involved burying the used cloths in churchyards as offerings to the Virgin Mary. These superstitions coexisted with Christianity in odd harmony, equal parts faith and folklore, hygiene and hope, and let's not forget the smell. Odour was an ever-present concern, especially given the lack of true absorbency and the warm, layered clothing of the time. Royal women carried scented sachets in their skirts, or pinned to underclothes, filled with clove, cinnamon, or dried citrus peel. Some even went so far as to dab perfume directly onto the cloths, an action that could cause irritation or infection, but which was still considered preferable to offending a courtier's nose. Chambermaids bore the brunt of this burden. They managed the cloths, washed them by hand, dried them in hidden courtyards or attic rooms, and stored them in discreet drawers. In some cases, they even tracked their mistress's cycle for her, quietly alerting her when it was time to prepare. One maid's diary includes a brief but telling line: "Tuesday, the lady's moon returns, laid out 3 cloths, sprinkled with jasmine, prayed for grace. Open scholarly debate surrounds whether these cloths were truly effective or if they merely soaked and chafed. Some argue that upper-class women bled less due to diet and lifestyle, making light protection sufficient. Others point to recurring complaints of women's troubles and frequent pelvic infections as evidence that these makeshift methods were far from adequate. One historical curiosity is that some queens had specially sewn menstrual petticoats, dark-coloured, heavily layered skirts worn only during their cycle. These garments helped conceal stains and allowed for fewer cloth changes. They were often nicknamed Crimson Guards or Scarlet Soldiers, and a few have survived in textile collections, rare stained relics of quiet endurance. As medical knowledge improved, so did menstrual care, but slowly. By the late 19th century, early sanitary napkins began appearing in pharmacies, but royal women were hesitant to adopt them. Disposable products were seen as vulgar or wasteful. Cloth remained the standard, just more refined, stitched with lace, perfumed more subtly, and laundered with better soaps. Still, the culture of silence persisted. In her letters, Queen Victoria never once refers to her period by name, even when describing symptoms. Other royal women used vague phrases like "my womanly calendar" or "the necessary pause." It wasn't until well into the 20th century that open discussion began creeping into public discourse, and even then it was heavily coded. But for centuries before that, royal women endured their cycles under heavy skirts, rigid corsets, and rigid expectations. They smiled through cramps, stood through ceremonies, and waltzed, while wondering if their cloths had shifted. Their periods were invisible to the world, but intimately known to the chambermaids who managed the stains, the odours, and the unspoken burden of keeping everything under wraps. So the next time you unwrap a modern pad or scroll through discrete period app notifications, take a moment to remember the queens who had none of that, who wore their pain beneath layers of silk, who bled in secret, who whispered to their maids for fresh linens instead of painkillers. They may have ruled empires, but their cycles still ruled them. Long before modern dermatology and SPF ratings, ancient queens and empresses ventured into a curious realm of beauty and protection, a place where mythology, medicine, and manure met on their faces. Among the most startling and unforgettable entries in the Royal Hygiene Archive is the use of crocodile dung as sunscreen and skincare. Yes, crocodile dung. Spread, layered, and sometimes mixed with honey or oils, this unlikely beauty balm was believed to guard delicate royal skin from sun damage and other imagined dangers. Let's start in ancient Egypt, where the Nile flowed alongside both practical wisdom and flamboyant excess. The sun was revered and feared in equal measure. It nourished crops, but it also blistered skin and deepened complexions in a society that associated lighter skin with nobility and indoor luxury. For queens like Cleopatra and Nefertiti, whose beauty was not only legendary but politically symbolic, maintaining a flawless pale complexion was a matter of royal importance. Enter the crocodile. These Nile reptiles were both sacred and feared, worshipped in the form of the god Sobek, guardian of fertility and protector of the pharaoh. But they were also harvested, in a sense. Their waste, collected fresh or dried, was believed to contain mystical and medicinal properties. Mixed with sour milk and honey, the dung was used as a facial mask. Its supposed benefits: sun protection, skin softening, and even anti-aging effects. There is scholarly debate over whether this practice was widespread or reserved for the elite. Some records suggest crocodile dung was applied only during ceremonial spa treatments, lengthy ritualistic sessions involving music, scented oils, and attendants waving palm fans. Others believe it was used regularly, particularly by those spending time in palace gardens or travelling between temples. What's less debatable is the sheer oddity of it. Even in an age when dung was used in poultices, fuel, and farming, smearing it on the royal face was a stretch. But ancient Egyptian papyri refer to it casually, alongside recipes for eye creams and hair oils. It was just another part of the beauty routine. The smell? Likely unbearable. But in a world where perfume was potent, and the nose often overwhelmed by incense and oils, it may have been tolerable, or simply masked by other scents. Rosewater, myrrh, and frankincense were commonly used to cloak less appealing aromas, so while a queen's face might smell like a Nile lagoon in theory, In practice, it probably gave off a more floral cloud. The dung wasn't just cosmetic, it also had a place in ancient contraceptive law. Women, including royals, were advised to insert a mixture of crocodile dung and fermented substances into the vagina as a barrier against pregnancy. This application was supposedly based on the belief that the texture and acidity would block or kill sperm. While clearly dubious by modern standards, the practice reveals just how versatile this swampy substance was in the royal hygiene arsenal. Crocodile dung wasn't alone in this peculiar pantheon. Other ancient beauty treatments used similarly exotic and eyebrow-raising ingredients. Donkey milk baths were all the rage among Roman empresses. Cleopatra herself was said to have needed hundreds of donkeys to supply her with enough milk for a single soak. The lactic acid was thought to exfoliate and smooth the skin. The reality? Sticky, lukewarm, and requiring an entire staff to manage. In India, royal women used sandalwood pastes and turmeric masks to protect against sun damage and maintain a golden glow. In China, pearl powder was crushed and applied as a skin lightener and sunscreen. These treatments, unlike the crocodile mask, had some basis in what we'd now consider active ingredients: antioxidants, mild exfoliants, and UV reflectors. But even they came with complications. Pearl powder, for instance, was sometimes mixed with mercury to boost its radiance. Back in Egypt, crocodile dung wasn't the only substance applied in the name of beauty. Henna was used to tint nails, palms, and even scalps. Malachite, a green mineral ground into powder, was painted around the eyes as an early form of eyeliner. And of course, lead-based creams made their appearance here too, exported and traded across empires. But dung retained its unique position as the most eyebrow-raising and probably the most pungent part of the routine. Open scholarly debate continues over whether crocodile dung had any actual sun-blocking properties. Some modern researchers suggest that, when dried and mixed with certain oils, it might have formed a physical barrier on the skin. But protection would have been minimal at best, and the risk of infection or irritation would have far outweighed any benefits. Yet the belief persisted for centuries, in part because beauty in the ancient world wasn't about science, it was about symbolism. Applying a sacred animal's waste to your face wasn't about logic, it was a ritual, a connection to the divine, a reminder that even the queen's body was linked to the rhythms of nature, of the Nile, of the gods who ruled the sun and the underworld. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and we find similar themes. Though crocodiles were less accessible, noble women turned to other equally eccentric means of skincare. Some applied bat blood or frog spawn to their cheeks. Others used mixtures of vinegar, white lead, and animal fat. Still others opted for crushed snails or earthworms as part of anti-aging masks. Dung, in a variety of forms, never fully disappeared from the recipe books of elite apothecaries. Even in the 18th century, a few eccentric royals clung to the idea of animal-based skincare. There's a peculiar tale of an Austrian countess who imported crocodile dung from Africa, more for its rarity than its efficacy. She had it blended with ambergris and almond oil, hoping to create the elixir of eternal youth. The result, according to her housemaid's journal, smelled like a rotting temple, and the countess wore it with great confidence. Perfume manufacturers, ever the opportunists, attempted to bottle the mystique. Some early fragrance recipes included musk of swamp beast, or essence of Nile, vaguely referencing the crocodile without mentioning the less appealing details. These perfumes were exotic, mysterious, and extremely expensive. They were not, thankfully, widely popular. The crocodile itself eventually faded from fashion, replaced by less fragrant icons of power and beauty. But the idea of smearing something wild, rare, and dangerous on one's skin in the name of beauty never truly went away. Even today, modern beauty trends boast ingredients like snail mucin, bee venom, and fish roe. Proof that the line between luxury and lunacy is surprisingly thin. So the next time you apply your SPF 50 moisturiser, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. No dung, no reptiles, no swamp-sourced sacrifices, just a pleasant cream with scientifically tested UV protection. And yet, somewhere in the layered legends of beauty history, you can still picture a queen standing by the banks of the Nile. Her skin shimmering with honey, her hair scented with myrrh, and her face, beneath a delicate veil, gently drying under the Egyptian sun dappled in crocodile. It begins as a tiny dot carefully positioned near the lip or beside the eye. But it's not a freckle, it's a patch, a deliberate, often velvet or silk appliqué known as a beauty spot. For centuries, these spots adorned the faces of royal women, serving as both cosmetic enhancement and subtle communication device. They were flirtatious, symbolic, and, ironically, often used to conceal the very infections and scars that resulted from the beauty standards of their day. The beauty spot, or mouche as the French elegantly dubbed it, meaning fly, gained traction in the 17th century and flourished throughout the 18th. On the powdered, perfumed stage of court life, a woman's face was not merely her own, it was a canvas. And these patches were her punctuation marks, applied in the shape of moons, hearts, stars, or simple circles. Beauty spots highlighted features, concealed blemishes, and sent coded messages to those in the know. Placed on the right cheek, that indicated a married woman. On the left cheek, she might be single and available. A beauty spot on the chin could suggest boldness. One by the eye was flirtatious. On the nose, playful, bordering on cheeky. Like emojis for the 1700s, these patches created an entire language of seduction and status, all without a word being spoken. But behind the velvet charm lurked something far more sinister. These beauty patches often covered smallpox scars, infected boils, or rashes caused by lead-based cosmetics. Smallpox in particular was a constant and terrifying presence. While some royals escaped unscathed, many bore lifelong facial reminders of the disease, and in the hypervisual court, even a single scar could threaten a woman's social currency. That's where the beauty patch came in. It didn't just accessorize, it disguised. A duchess who had once been admired for her flawless complexion might, after illness, re-emerge into court wearing a tiny silk heart on her temple, not as a whim, but as strategic camouflage. Even Queen Elizabeth I, centuries earlier, was rumoured to use early versions of face patches, likely more crude and less symbolic, to mask the pockmarks left by her bout with smallpox. Her famously pale visage, created with layers of Venetian ceruse, that toxic lead-based concoction, sometimes cracked or blistered. Rather than reveal these imperfections, small bits of cloth or wax were applied to maintain the illusion of perfection. In France, the mouche rose to its greatest heights, literally and socially. The court of Louis XV was a hotbed of patch politics. Women competed not just in gowns and jewels, but in how artfully they arranged their beauty spots. Whole kits were sold containing pre-cut shapes, tweezers, and small mirrored cases for on-the-go application. Some women kept dozens, rotating them like jewellery. Fashion magazines of the day published diagrams suggesting ideal placement based on face shape and occasion. The patches were often made from black silk or velvet, chosen to contrast dramatically with powdered white skin. Some were glued on with natural adhesives, honey, tree sap, or softened beeswax. Others used fish bladder glue, a product that was both effective and deeply unpleasant in scent. One fringe trend even involved scented patches. These were pre-soaked in rosewater or musk and stored in ornate boxes. The idea was to enhance one's presence in close conversations. But the mix of perfume and adhesive often caused skin irritation, especially when placed on already inflamed or broken skin. Infections weren't uncommon. If the underlying blemish was an open sore, covering it with a patch could trap bacteria and exacerbate the condition. Some women developed oozing pustules beneath their beauty spots, while others suffered allergic reactions to the glues. Yet the aesthetic payoff was considered worth it. Better a swollen, fragrant heart on your cheek than the visible reminder of a pustule. And of course, the game of placement had its own social consequences. A poorly placed patch could be read as desperate or vulgar. A woman who wore too many was considered frivolous. Too few, and she risked looking unfashionable or overly austere. There are records of courtiers gossiping viciously over patch choices, interpreting a star below the eye as a scandalous confession, or a moon near the mouth as an invitation too bold. One particularly memorable moment occurred during a masquerade ball at the Austrian court. A baroness arrived with a constellation of beauty spots shaped like the Big Dipper across her temple and forehead. It was meant as a tribute to the stars, but instead sparked rumours of madness. The king's sister was heard muttering, "She must be hiding the pox." The next day, the baroness was conspicuously absent from court. The beauty patch craze also extended to men, though more discreetly. Some noblemen, especially in France and Italy, adopted small patches to cover shaving nicks or acne scars. A black dot near the corner of the mouth might seem roguish. One by the temple could imply melancholy or poetic depth. But for men, patches were more occasional flirtations with vanity, while for women, they were nearly mandatory. Eventually the patches crept beyond the face. By the late 18th century, women applied them to shoulders, décolletage, even breasts, especially during lavish balls where necklines plunged and visibility soared. These patches became almost like tattoos, stylized declarations of mood, identity, or secret meanings known only to a select few. Open scholarly debate surrounds whether the language of patches was truly standardized or simply a retrospective projection. Did everyone agree on the meanings? Or did people just pretend to know the code while making it up as they went along? Either way, the patches functioned as both concealment and performance, offering women a tool for navigating the treacherous terrain of courtly appearance. The eventual fall of the beauty patch wasn't due to hygiene concerns. Rather, it faded with the waning of powdered makeup and exaggerated fashion. As Enlightenment ideals ushered in more natural appearances and classical simplicity, the need for artificial accents like mouche declined. By the early 19th century, beauty spots were seen as outdated, relics of a frivolous and overly painted past. And yet, they never disappeared entirely. Even today, artificial beauty marks make periodic comebacks in fashion and film. From Marilyn Monroe's iconic lip mold to Madonna's retro stylings in the 1980s, the appeal of a strategic spot endures. Cosmetic brands even sell temporary beauty mark stickers, a direct descendant of the velvet mouche. There's something irresistibly human about the beauty patch. It speaks to our desire to hide, to adorn, to communicate without words. For royal women, it was armour, tiny, stylish shields against scrutiny and imperfection. In a world where their value was often tied to flawless skin and public composure, the beauty spot offered a small but powerful way to reclaim their face, scars and all. So the next time you spot a mole, a freckle, or a beauty mark, remember the queens who placed theirs just so, who carried silk stars on their cheeks and hearts near their eyes, who smiled through the itch, the sting, the whispers, and who, beneath every patch, bore the truth that even perfection sometimes needs a little help. The powder room, a phrase that conjures elegance, pearls and perfume, once held a far more dangerous secret. Long before beauty aisle meant safe, hypoallergenic products, the cosmetics favoured by royal women were more chemistry experiment than self-care. In their relentless quest for flawless skin, vivid eyes and bright complexions, queens and noble ladies regularly applied substances that would make a modern dermatologist faint. Arsenic, mercury and belladonna, to name a few. It wasn't a matter of occasional use or fringe fashion. These poisons were central ingredients in some of the most popular beauty treatments in the courts of Europe and beyond. They were sold in ornate jars, recommended by court physicians and applied daily, layered into routines that might involve as many as 20 steps. The result was a face that glowed under candlelight, mesmerized admirers, and slowly corroded the skin, damaged the organs, and in many cases hastened death. Start with the face powder. The whitest, most radiant skin was the ultimate mark of aristocracy. It symbolized purity, leisure, and the kind of life lived far from the sunburned backs of labourers. Achieving this look required more than light skin. It demanded luminously pale skin, free of blemish or shadow. And for that, women turned to Venetian ceruse. Venetian ceruse, a favourite among Elizabethan and Baroque nobility, was a white paste made from lead acetate. It went on smooth, covered scars and smallpox pockmarks, and provided a matte, ghostly finish beloved in court portraiture. The application wasn't subtle. Women layered it on thick, sometimes with small spatulas or cloth pads. It sat atop the skin like a porcelain mask, cracking only with facial movement. But this wasn't your grandmother's face powder. Lead acetate is now recognised as highly toxic. Repeated exposure damages the kidneys, disrupts the nervous system, and can lead to hallucinations, paralysis, and death. It also causes the very skin conditions it was meant to hide: blemishes, dryness, and peeling, which led users to apply even more of it. A vicious shimmering cycle. The lips weren't spared. Royal women painted their mouths red using compounds that included mercury sulfide known as vermilion. It delivered a vivid, blood-like hue that suggested vitality and passion. but mercury absorbed quickly through the delicate skin of the lips, leading to tremors, vision problems, and neurological damage. Over time, lips darkened unnaturally or peeled, requiring ever more layers of pigment to hide the decay beneath. For the eyes, women reached for belladonna, an extract from the deadly nightshade plant. Just a drop in each eye dilated the pupils, giving the wide, luminous gaze so prized in Renaissance portraits. But belladonna's beauty came at a steep price. Blurred vision, dry eyes, sensitivity to light, and long-term damage to the optic nerves. Some royal women lost their vision altogether from regular use. There's a chilling irony in the fact that these poisons were embraced in the pursuit of beauty. Women knowingly risked their health, and sometimes their sanity, for the sake of appearance. But in court society, where a woman's face could determine her fortune, her marriage prospects, and her influence, beauty wasn't optional. It was armour. And in the powder room, arsenic was just another weapon. Indeed, arsenic itself became a cosmetic in the 18th and 19th centuries. Sold in wafers or dissolved in tonics, it was marketed as a complexion clearer. Taken orally, arsenic pills promised to banish freckles, smooth the skin, and produce the desired translucent look. In reality, they destroyed red blood cells and weakened the heart. Historians still argue over how widespread arsenic consumption really was. Some claim it was a fringe practice among desperate women. Others suggest it was shockingly common, especially in the French and Austrian courts. What's clear is that multiple royal figures displayed symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning. Trembling hands, chronic fatigue, sudden mood swings. And then there were the painted ladies. Noble women so heavily made up with lead and mercury compounds that their faces looked more like painted dolls than human beings. They spoke through pursed lips, moved with slow grace to avoid cracking their paint, and often carried scented fans to deflect the stench of their own skin breaking down beneath the glamour. Open, scholarly debate surrounds whether these women were aware of the risks. Some documents suggest they were warned by doctors, only to ignore or downplay the advice. Others point out that many court physicians actively prescribed these compounds, believing that outward appearance was directly tied to inner health. A pale face, they argued, reflected a cool, balanced temperament. A flushed cheek might suggest a fevered mind or lustful disposition. One of the most tragic and bizarre side effects of toxic makeup was the phenomenon known as mercurial madness. Women who used mercury-based creams and lip stains over long periods began exhibiting signs of confusion, memory loss, and erratic behaviour. Some were quietly sequestered in private chambers, their decline attributed to female hysteria or melancholy. But journals and letters hint at a different cause: poison, applied daily with a delicate hand. An infamous case comes from the court of Charles II of England. One of his mistresses, the celebrated beauty Nell Gwyn, was known for her radiant skin and bright eyes. But behind the scenes, she suffered from trembling limbs and severe headaches. Whether her death at age 37 was from mercury poisoning or a stroke remains debated, but her symptoms suggest the former. Another cautionary tale is that of Maria Leopoldina of Austria, who in her early 20s began using a cream known as lily-of-the-valley extract. The cream contained lead, mercury, and powdered pearl. Her letters describe initial delight. Her skin became as white as sugar icing, followed by fatigue, rashes, and a mysterious wasting illness. She died before 30. Her attendants later reported that her nightgowns were often stained yellow from the cream's residue, even days after her final use. It wasn't just the face. Poison seeped into hair care as well. Women used lead combs to darken greying strands and arsenic-infused tonics to encourage growth. These substances absorbed through the scalp, producing migraines, hair loss, and even open sores. One French duchess had her hair styled so elaborately with toxic pomades and powders that her scalp became infected, leading to partial baldness. She responded by commissioning a towering wig, another layer of artifice atop the damage. Fringe stories tell of assassins using cosmetic supplies to deliver poison, slipping arsenic into a rival's face powder, or mercury into her perfume. While these accounts are often dramatised, they underscore how deeply embedded poisons were in the world of aristocratic beauty. The very things designed to elevate could destroy, and still the rituals endured. Powder was applied each morning, touched up through the day, and reapplied in the evening. Women developed techniques to reduce absorption, coating their skin in beeswax or oil before the poisonous layer went on. But these were inconsistent and imperfect. The long-term toll was inevitable. By the mid-19th century, medical science began catching up. Physicians and chemists sounded louder warnings. Arsenic and mercury were banned in some countries. Safer alternatives, like zinc-based powders and plant-derived dyes, entered the market. But the damage had already been done. Generations of royal women had paid dearly for their porcelain perfection. Today, modern cosmetics are rigorously tested and regulated, or at least should be. But the legacy of poison in the powder room still lingers. The idea that beauty must come with sacrifice, that to be seen as elegant a woman must endure discomfort or risk, remains deeply woven into our cultural fabric. The queens and countesses who lined their eyes with belladonna, who kissed with mercury-red lips, who powdered their faces into glowing ghosts, they weren't vain or foolish. They were products of their time, navigating impossible standards with the tools they were given. They wore their poisons like jewels, not because they loved danger, but because the alternative, being plain, being overlooked, was a kind of social death. So the next time you swipe on lipstick or dust your face with powder, think of them. Think of the velvet boxes lined with death, the delicate brushes dipped in danger, the women who shimmered under chandeliers while their skin wept beneath the glamour. They died to be beautiful, sometimes slowly, sometimes silently, always elegantly. Picture the finest silk, shimmering, smooth, stitched by hand, and destined to touch only the most sacred of skin. Now imagine that same silk never seeing a drop of soap or water, worn and reworn beneath royal gowns day after day, absorbing sweat, perfume, and the secrets of court life. Welcome to the world of royal underwear, where the daintiest garments were often the dirtiest, and where silk drawers might carry more stories than a duchess's diary. While the image of queens and empresses conjures visions of opulent gowns and jewelled corsets, the intimate layers beneath were rarely seen, rarely discussed, and, perhaps most shocking of all, rarely washed. Silk underclothes, favoured for their softness and luxurious feel, were expensive, delicate, and considered far too precious to be subjected to the rigours of laundering. The result? Regal rashes, hidden infections, and a scent that even the strongest rose sachets couldn't fully disguise. In many royal courts, undergarments weren't merely practical, they were symbolic. Silk drawers or petticoats whispered of wealth and refinement. Linen chemises absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the outer garments from the body's realities. But these protective layers were themselves treated like semi-sacred relics, carefully removed, aired out, dusted with powder, and then returned to drawers, still dirty, just dried. The logic, such as it was, hinged on the belief that too much washing would ruin the integrity of the fabric. Silk, in particular, was seen as too fragile for soap and water. Laundresses might gently shake out the garments, spot-treat visible stains, and hang them in the sun to refresh them. But full immersion? Rare. Many noblewomen had specific instructions not to wash their underthings unless absolutely necessary, which usually meant blood, vomit, or something that made the garment physically unwearable. Some women preferred to layer silk with linen, letting the more durable and easier to clean linen touch the skin while the silk provided the luxury. But this wasn't always the case. In hotter climates or during formal occasions, silk went straight onto the body and stayed there for days. Multiple layers trapped heat and sweat, and though corsets shaped the torso into ideal silhouettes, they also prevented any kind of airflow. A royal woman might spend 12 hours in public, sitting through court functions, religious ceremonies, and banquets, while her unwashed underclothes clung damply beneath everything. One particularly vivid account comes from the 17th century Spanish court, where Queen Mariana of Austria's wardrobe included dozens of silk petticoats, but only a handful of linen chemises. Her laundresses were instructed to avoid scrubbing any garment that did not show open blemish. This phrase became a euphemism among her attendants for a variety of unpleasant visual cues, from sweat rings to insect stains. The consequences were as predictable as they were unpleasant. Rashes, yeast infections, boils, and chafing plagued even the most carefully adorned royal figures. Of course, these afflictions were not publicly acknowledged. Medical treatments were administered discreetly, often under vague diagnoses like hot blood, internal imbalance, or skin vapours. Herbal poultices were applied in private, and court physicians prescribed tonics that supposedly cooled the humours. Chambermaids, once again, became the silent custodians of royal hygiene. They knew which underclothes were clean in name only. They sniffed discreetly, aired out linens in attic rooms, and often powdered the crotch and underarm areas with mixtures of rice flour and crushed herbs. In some cases, they sewed tiny sachets of lavender or mint into the hems of petticoats to ward off both odour and insects. Yet even these remedies had limits. When the body beneath the silk was suffering, perfume became less a luxury and more a desperate attempt at containment. One French duchess, whose letters to her sister survive, described her efforts to disguise the whisper of mildew beneath her skirts using lemon balm and crushed violet leaves. It was a poetic way of saying, "I stink, but I sparkle." One fringe detail often omitted from grand paintings and court documents: lice. While head lice often receive attention thanks to powdered wigs, body lice, especially in undergarments, were a persistent issue. The warmth and moisture of the underlayers created an ideal breeding ground. Some noble women were fitted with lice traps, tiny cloth pouches lined with fur or wax that attracted parasites away from the skin. These traps were discreetly sewn into corset linings or the folds of petticoats and replaced periodically, usually without the knowledge of the wearer. The layering itself was complex and dictated by social norms, climate and fashion trends. A typical undergarment ensemble for a royal woman in 18th century Europe might include a chemise, corset or stays, one or more petticoats, stockings held up with garters, drawers, optional depending on region and era, and a shift or underdress. In winter, layers increased. In summer, they grew lighter, but no cleaner. And unlike today, underclothes were not meant to be invisible. In some eras, glimpses of silk stocking or a finely embroidered petticoat were part of courtly flirtation. A flash of a garter or a rustle of lace hinted at status and sensuality. But even as they titillated, these glimpses never revealed the truth, that the garment had perhaps seen 3 royal functions, 2 days of travel, and 1 nervous, sweat-drenched sermon without a wash. Open scholarly debate remains over how often underclothes were truly laundered in royal households. Some point to household records showing regular deliveries to the washhouse. Others argue that these records include outerwear, sheets, and table linens, not the silk drawers hiding beneath the Queen's brocade. The truth likely varies by region, era, and individual preference. But personal journals, medical notes, and chambermaid accounts make one thing clear: silk was rarely washed, and royal bodies suffered for it. A particularly tragic example comes from the Russian court, where Empress Anna Ivanovna reportedly wore the same set of silk drawers for over 2 weeks during a winter hunting retreat. By the end of the trip, she had developed a painful rash that progressed into an infection. Her physicians blamed dampness of the skin and applied mustard poultices and leech therapy. Modern readers might diagnose it as bacterial dermatitis, exacerbated by chafing and poor airflow. Either way, the undergarments were retired, ceremonially even, as if they were war heroes. Not all royal women endured in silence. Some, especially in the later 19th century, began demanding cleaner garments and more frequent laundering. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, known for her obsession with cleanliness and fitness, changed her underclothes daily and insisted on linen rather than silk for practical wear. Her routines were considered eccentric at the time, but her insistence on freshness marked the beginning of a slow cultural shift. Still, for centuries, the idea of clean remained tied more to scent and appearance than actual sanitation. A petticoat could be deemed wearable as long as it wasn't visibly soiled or offensively pungent, and so silk underthings were dusted, perfumed, folded, and returned to duty. Today, the idea of unwashed underwear, especially in the high heat and close quarters of palatial life, seems unimaginable. But for royal women of the past, it was just another part of the performance. They wore layers of secrecy beneath their silks, stitched with duty and discomfort, every movement a reminder that elegance often comes at a cost. So the next time you slip into clean cotton, or toss your laundry in the wash without a second thought, remember the queens who didn't have that luxury, who powdered their thighs, smiled through rashes, and ruled empires while quietly itching beneath the seams. Their underwear might have been regal, but their relief was anything but. In the richly embroidered world of royal life, not all that was cherished gleamed with gold or jewels. Some of the most treasured items were downright filthy, literally. When it came to blending faith, superstition, and hygiene, royal women throughout history embraced a peculiar set of relics, rituals and beliefs that prized holy dirt, stinky saints, and even the supposed healing power of filth. To be unwashed wasn't always a sign of laziness. Sometimes it was divine. At the heart of this paradox were saints, particularly those whose lives were marked by piety, suffering, and in many cases an aversion to bathing. The early Christian tradition celebrated asceticism. The more a saint denied the body, the closer she was believed to be to God, and denying the body often meant refusing to wash it. These holy figures, canonized and revered, became spiritual role models. Their unwashed bodies, believed to exude a sacred scent called the odour of sanctity, were considered untouchable, incorruptible, and miraculously preserved. Royal women, raised in devout households, absorbed these teachings early. To suffer was noble. To endure physical discomfort, or even repulsion, was virtuous. And so it wasn't unusual for a queen or princess to revere, wear, or even carry with her objects associated with saintly dirt or decay. These were called relics, and they came in many forms: bones, scraps of clothing, locks of hair, and in rarer cases dust collected from a saint's tomb. Some were worn in lockets, others were sewn into undergarments. A few were buried inside the foundations of palaces or castles, thought to sanctify the very ground. One fringe but well-documented practice was the smearing of saintly dust on wounds or blemishes. In the 14th century French court, a queen known only as Isabeau is said to have dabbed her temples with a mixture of holy soil and honey during bouts of fever. The soil came from the site of a martyr's death, shipped in a silver box from a monastery in Spain. Whether it healed her or simply made her smell like a compost bin, no one knows. But the belief endured. Filth touched by the divine was no longer filth. It was a blessing. Perhaps the most eyebrow-raising example of sacred stench comes from the cult of St. Catherine of Siena. A 14th century mystic, Catherine famously claimed that she hadn't bathed or changed her clothes for years, offering her physical decay as a form of sacrifice. Despite, or perhaps because of, her state, she was venerated across Europe. Pieces of her garments were passed between noble women as healing talismans. One Italian duchess is reported to have kept a scrap of Catherine's robe in a velvet pouch near her skin at all times. Her servants complained of the smell. The duchess called it the scent of heaven. Royal women collected these relics with obsessive devotion. Lockets might contain a splinter from the true cross, a thread from the Virgin Mary's cloak, or even a phial of murky water said to be from the Jordan River. These items were believed to offer protection, not just spiritual but physical. When illness struck, a queen might press a relic to her chest or forehead, whispering prayers for healing. Physicians often indulged these practices, blending their rudimentary medical knowledge with spiritual rituals. After all, what could be more reassuring than believing a bit of sanctified rot could keep the plague at bay? Of course, not all holy dirt was metaphorical. Some was very literal. In parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, royal women visited pilgrimage sites where the soil itself was thought to be miraculous. They would kneel in it, sprinkle it over their heads, or carry it home in jars. At the shrine of St. Hedwig in Silesia, visitors, many of them noble women, wore special pouches designed to hold blessed mud, taken from beneath the saint's tomb. Back home, it was mixed with oil and applied to skin conditions, or used in fertility rituals. Some women even placed it under their pillows to ward off nightmares. This mingling of faith and filth didn't stop at relics. Some royal women adopted the cleanliness habits of saints, or rather, their lack thereof. In the Russian Orthodox tradition, holy fools, people who lived in filth to demonstrate detachment from worldly concerns, were deeply revered. Stories of female ascetics who never bathed yet glowed with divine light circulated in royal circles. A few eccentric noblewomen emulated these saints, refusing to bathe during Lent or abstaining from perfumes and powders for religious fasts. One open scholarly debate surrounds the impact of these practices on health. While the veneration of unwashed saints may have inspired spiritual strength, it also likely contributed to skin diseases, lice infestations, and outbreaks of contagious illness. And yet, these consequences were often seen as tests from God, opportunities to prove one's faith. In Spain, Queen Isabella the Catholic was known for her piety, and reportedly bathed so infrequently that she could smell herself from several feet away. yet her spiritual devotion was so admired that no one dared mention it. When asked about her aversion to bathing, she's rumoured to have replied, "My purity is of the soul, not the skin." Even sacred architecture reflected this blending of hygiene and holiness. Bathing chambers in some royal residences were located near chapels or meditation rooms, allowing queens to purify the spirit and the body in a single visit. But these baths were often symbolic, foot soaks or dab downs with scented cloths, not full-body scrubs. A queen might emerge spiritually refreshed but physically unchanged. Of course, some took the opposite approach. Catherine de' Medici, while deeply religious, also embraced perfumes and medicinal baths. She commissioned alchemists to create scented waters blessed by priests and intended to purify body and soul. Her blend of faith and fragrance was unusual, yet it foreshadowed a modern shift toward hygiene that still retained spiritual undertones. Yet the old traditions lingered. In Poland, Hungary and parts of Italy, noble women clung to their relics and sacred dirt well into the 19th century. Some even incorporated it into childbirth rituals, believing that smearing blessed earth on the belly would ease labour or protect the child from evil. One Milanese princess, in labour for 36 hours, was reportedly covered head to toe in holy dust and oils. The midwives wept with joy when the baby arrived safely. Whether it was faith, dirt or chance remains unknown. A particularly bizarre tradition involved the wearing of hair shirts during menstruation or illness. These were rough garments made from animal hair or coarse cloth, worn under royal gowns to irritate the skin and promote spiritual humility. The logic: suffering cleansed the soul. The reality: chafing, rashes, and the kind of odour that not even clove stuffed sachets could mask. Even death couldn't stop the tradition. Royal tombs often included relics sewn into burial garments. A queen might be interred with a fragment of bone, a vial of sacred oil, or a scoop of holy dirt tucked near the heart. The belief was simple: what kept her safe in life would guide her safely to the afterlife. Today, such practices seem archaic, even absurd. But for centuries, royal women walked a fine line between devotion and decay. They endured filth in the name of faith, welcomed sacred dirt into their homes, and wore relics on their skin. To be holy was not to be clean, it was to be chosen, set apart, and if that meant smelling like a crypt or sleeping on a pouch of soil, so be it. So the next time you light a scented candle or slip into a freshly laundered robe, remember the queens who chose dirt over diamonds, stench over soap, and sanctity over sanitation. Their purity wasn't measured in baths taken but in blessings believed. And their relics? They weren't trinkets. They were talismans of survival, of suffering, and of a world where holy dirt was the cleanest thing of all. The final curtain of our journey through royal hygiene falls not with a bang but with a whiff. As the Enlightenment dawned and scientific understanding blossomed, the age-old practices of masking odours and avoiding baths began to wane. Yet the transition was neither swift nor uniform. In the grand palaces and secluded chambers of royalty, the echoes of past routines lingered, even as new standards of cleanliness emerged. In the 18th century, the tides of hygiene began to shift. The medical community started to challenge the long-held belief that bathing opened the pores to disease. Instead, cleanliness was increasingly associated with health and virtue. Public bathhouses, once shunned, regained popularity. The affluent began to install private bathing facilities, and the act of bathing transformed from a rare indulgence to a regular practice. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, consort to King George II, was a pioneer in this regard. She had a bathroom installed in her private apartments at Hampton Court Palace, complete with a wooden tub and a supply of cold running water. Hot water had to be brought up by servants, but the very presence of such a facility marked a significant departure from previous norms. Caroline's bathing practices, though still modest by today's standards, signalled a growing acceptance of regular bathing among the elite. Despite these advancements, old habits died hard. Perfumes and powders remained staples in the royal toilette, not just for their scents, but as symbols of sophistication. The use of cosmetics persisted, though formulations gradually became less toxic. Lead-based powders gave way to safer alternatives, and the heavy makeup of previous centuries was replaced by a more natural look. The evolution of hygiene also brought changes in dental care. While toothbrushes as we know them were not yet common, various methods were employed to maintain oral cleanliness. Cloths soaked in herbal mixtures were used to rub the teeth and gums, and mouthwashes made from vinegar, wine, and alum were popular. These practices, though rudimentary, laid the groundwork for modern dental hygiene. As the 19th century progressed, the Industrial Revolution brought about significant improvements in sanitation and public health. Indoor plumbing became more widespread, allowing for greater access to clean water. The installation of toilets and sewage systems in royal residences further enhanced the standards of cleanliness. Yet, even with these advancements, the legacy of past practices lingered. The use of chamber pots persisted in some quarters, and the reliance on servants for personal hygiene tasks remained a fixture of royal life. The transition to modern hygiene was a gradual process, marked by both progress and resistance. In the twilight of this era, the royal approach to cleanliness had transformed. The days of masking odours with perfumes and avoiding baths for fear of disease were fading. In their place emerged a new ethos that embraced regular bathing, dental care, and a more scientific understanding of health. The journey from the perfumed chambers of Versailles to the tiled bathrooms of Victorian palaces was complete. And now, dear night owl, the last candle flickers. The scent of lavender hangs faintly in the air, mingling with the quiet hush that settles over worn stone and velvet-draped history. We've wandered through shadowy palace corridors and stood silently in the powder-sweet wake of queens, peering into rituals that once passed for refinement. We've lifted the edge of silk petticoats and whispered beside rosewater basins where dignity and decay shared the same scented cloth. It's strange, isn't it, that something so intimate, so human, as hygiene could feel both regal and tragic. In those perfumed chambers and gilded halls, beneath brocade and bone corsets, lived women as real as breath. They scratched at rashes, dabbed at their skin with honey and fear, wrapped their monthly secrets in linen and wore masks, sometimes of ceruse, sometimes of silence. Now, as the palace settles and the last footsteps fade, we leave those stories tucked gently where we found them, in the folds of history's bedclothes. The queens sleep on, dreamless perhaps, their powdered ghosts no longer needing to perform. If the world outside still feels too loud, let this quiet linger. Let your thoughts drift like incense rising through a candlelit chapel. Let the stories soften into whispers, and the laughter of powdered duchesses fade like echoes behind a silk curtain. You're safe now. The tapestries have stilled. The relics are returned to their velvet cases. The night has done its remembering. So close your eyes, breathe out. You've walked through centuries and secrets, and you've earned your rest. Good night, you gentle soul. Sleep deep, sleep kind.